Heavenly Father, we pray today for today's proceedings will occur in a safe and incident-free manner. And we seek your divine mercies as we prepare to debate a motion that is of both local and regional importance. This we ask in your mighty name, I pray. Amen. Announcements. On behalf of the Youth Parliament, especially the Senate, we wish to extend our deepest condolences to the fallen youth who was tragically taken away from this life. And in this regard, I will seek your indulgence in standing for a moment of silence. Thank you. Motion. Senator, Leader of Government Business.
Mr. President, I beg to move the following motion standing in my name. The Reparatory Justice Resolution 2026. Whereas it is well established that both the French and British colonists fought the Kalinago for territory, and that while indigenous population resisted European settlement for decades, that by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, indigenous communities lost most of their land through warfare, colonial expansion, disease, and displacement, and were forced to flee to nearby islands or placed on a reservation in Dominica and were replaced by enslaved Africans. And whereas it is well established that in 1772, in the decided case of Somerset and Stuart, noted that enslavement was outlawed in England, having been found to be contrary to the common law, and recalling that enslavement of individuals was nonetheless legal within the British colonial empire, leading to the unjust, inhumane, and forced removal of over 12 million Africans from the African continent to the Western Hemisphere, while deeming these humans as property or chattel in the Barbados Code of 1661. And understanding the role that these enslaved individuals, deprived of humanity, liberty rights, and an identity, played in the development of the early British and French colonies, the 18th century British economy, trade, and thereafter the financing of the European Industrial Revolution, which has definitively been linked as a driving force behind the present climate and environmental crisis, as well as the entrenching of its inhumanity and injustices into political, social, economic, and cultural institutions and systems globally. And cognizant of the impact that this brutal history has had on the development of Caribbean and African nations, including the long-standing and persistent erasure of culture, the impact on education systems, indigenous knowledge, the creation of generational wealth, technological advancement, the inequality of women, the destruction of the family, and the health of the people of these nations. And recalling that Parliament of the United Kingdom would discontinue the trading of enslaved individuals within the empire in 1807, while recollecting with concern that the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 guaranteed the right of freedom for the enslaved within the United Kingdom and its colonies, provide compensation only to the enslavers who deemed the enslaved as chattel rather than human beings deprived of freedom, including scores of enslavers within the then colony of St. Lucia, whose detailed financial claims remain within the annals of history. And further recalling that during that heinous period, 14 colonial wars were fought over St. Lucia, ensuring that the enslaved were 7 times British and 7 times French, conflicts which exacerbated the horrors of enslavement. And troubled by the continued societal issues that this chain of historical events have caused and have led to the United Nations 2001 declaration that slavery and the slave trade are crimes against humanity and should have always been so, the effects of which continue to manifest in structural inequality, underdevelopment, and racial injustice. And noting that on March 25, 2026, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution acknowledging that the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans and racialized chattel enslavement was a grievous crime against humanity. Be it resolved that the Youth Parliament of St. Lucia, the Reparatory Justice Resolution 2026, 1. Calls for the full and unreserved implementation of the CARICOM 10-point plan for reparatory justice. 2. Urges the government of St. Lucia to explore avenues for reparations from both the British and the French relating to the enduring socio-economic and environmental impacts of slavery and colonialism, including climate vulnerability. 3. Recommends the established National Reparations Committee coordinate all research, policy, and advocacy efforts on behalf of the government of St. Lucia. 4. Supports the development of legislation to govern the transparent management of any reparations resources. 5. Calls for comprehensive education reform to include African and Caribbean history, cultural identity, and reparations awareness within school curricula. 6. Encourages national public education campaigns to raise awareness about the legacy of enslavement and its modern-day impacts. 7. Promotes youth engagement and leadership in reparations, advocacy, and decision-making processes. 8. Supports the creation of funding mechanisms to invest in community development, education, and youth empowerment initiatives. 9. Encourages St. Lucia's foreign policy to align with regional and international efforts, advocating for reparatory justice. And be it further resolved that reparatory justice is a moral, legal, and historical obligation owed to the people of St. Lucia and that of the wider Caribbean. Good day, Mr. President, fellow parliamentarians, everyone else in the building, and listeners both local and abroad. Before I begin my presentation, I'd like to say rest in peace, especially to our recent fallen soldiers. If wealth can be inherited from generations, then so can the consequences of injustice. My government stands firmly in support of reparatory justice because slavery did not disappear, it evolved. The physical shackles may have been removed, but the invisible ones, many of the systems built, still shape inequality today. Reparatory justice is not about revenge, it is about accountability, acknowledgement, and repair. During the transatlantic slave trade, over 12 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homes, and millions died before even reaching the Americas. Britain paid slave owners £20 million in compensation after slavery was abolished in 1833, which was at that time 40% of the national budget, while the formerly enslaved people received nothing. Some descendants of enslaved people today still experience significantly lower generational wealth, land ownership, and access to opportunities compared to descendants of former slave-owning societies. This is not only emotional testimony. History, economics, and documented policy all support the long-term effects of slavery. We have inherited diseases, trauma, and abuse. We have been mocked, and we have been denied reparation. If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress, according to Malcolm X. They say slavery has ended, but are we really free, or has it simply just changed form? If wealth can be inherited from generations, then so can the consequences of injustice. How many of us have family members with diabetes, hypertension, cancer, and other illnesses? And honestly, sensitive, but how many of them are still alive today? How many people have we already lost? Because my grandmother had both diabetes and hypertension, and she's not here right now. So this topic is very personal to me. This isn't just history for me. These are our families. What if I told you that slavery did not only leave behind trauma, but also generational health issues that still affect especially Black people today? Enslaved Africans were forced to survive off harsh plantation diets, overloaded with sugar from the sugarcane fields that they worked tirelessly on, along with heavily salted foods used for preservation. And even generations later, Black communities still struggle disproportionately with hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, and other illnesses. And the opposition will simply say, watch what you eat. But how many diets is it going to take to fix something that has been affecting generations for hundreds of years? How many times are we going to blame individuals while ignoring the system that created it in the first place? Slaves are not long ago people. They are our great-grandparents, our grandparents' grandparents. Slavery only sounds so far away when people choose, keyword choose, to disconnect themselves from people who actually lived through it. And doesn't that say a lot about them? And every time we lose an elder, we're losing history too. We lose stories, we lose information, we lose data. We lose knowledge. We lose living proof of the hardship people endured without compensation, without justice, and without at least an apology. Instead of trying to repair that damage, people would rather water down the pain, avoid the conversation, and act like the effects magically disappeared in 1833. But pain does not disappear just because history books say slavery has ended. They say slavery has ended, but are we really free, or has it simply changed form? If wealth can be inherited from generations, Mr. President, then so can the consequences of injustice. What if I told you that alongside diseases, we also inherited trauma? We inherited abuse. We inherited fear. We inherited harmful beliefs and normalized them so deeply, so profoundly, that today, many of us do certain things and cannot even explain why. For example, there's a story about a little girl watching her mother cook fish. I'm not sure if you guys have heard. The mother cut the fish a certain way before putting it into the pot. So the child asked why. The mother said, I don't know, that's just how my mother did it. The child then asked the grandmother, and she said the same thing. I don't know, that's just how my mother did it. Eventually, the child reached the great-grandmother, and only then did they find out that the fish used to be cut because the pan was too small years ago. That story is deeper than people think. Generation after generation, we inherit habits, beliefs, trauma, punishments, and ways of thinking without ever questioning why, or even questioning where they came from. Eventually, our elders die. The answers die with them. And we continue repeating cycles simply because that's how we were raised. Look at corporal punishment. How many of us grew up hearing who the hair must feel? How many of us got beaten in the name of discipline? Hands against walls, kneeling down on gravel, bottle caps, or with books on our heads. Facing walls for hours, public embarrassment, fear, pain, and people normalized it because it was normalized for them. But where did that mentality come from, Mr. President? During slavery, enslaved Africans were whipped, beaten, humiliated, and tortured as a form of correction. Correction. Some were given hundreds of lashes. There was even a whip called a cat o' nine tails, designed specifically to intensify pain. And generations later, we still believe pain equals discipline. Didn't we recently have a case here in St. Lucia where a teacher allegedly threw an object at a child in a classroom and injured him? Even now, children continue suffering forms of punishment that many people excuse as normal discipline. And inherited trauma does not stop there. Look at the heartbreaking murder of 24-year-old Joyce and Omer, who was allegedly killed by a strange husband after reportedly making multiple reports to authorities about abuse and threats against her life. Joyce, someone I went to school with. Long live our white and blue. Again, rest in peace. Domestic abuse, violence, alcoholism, untreated anger, silence, fear. These things continue passing through generations too. Many people grow up surrounded by trauma for so long that it begins to feel normal. Slavery did not just damage bodies, it damaged minds, homes, families, parenting styles, relationships, and entire generations. And when people act like slavery was too long ago to matter today, I have to wonder if they truly understand how generational trauma really works. They say slavery has ended, but are we really free, or has it simply changed form? Mr. President, if wealth can be inherited from generations, then so can the consequences of injustice. Mr. President, they are mocking us. And the sad part is many of us do not even realize it. The same systems, names, institutions, and hierarchies created during slavery still exist today, just dressed differently. Even the United Kingdom has publicly stated at Commonwealth discussions that it would not apologize for its role in slavery. Think about that carefully. Saying you will not apologize for your role, it simply says that you acknowledge that there was a role to even begin with. And yet, instead of receiving reparatory justice, many former colonies are still economically tied to the same powers that benefited from slavery in the first place. And we normalize it. We praise it. We place it on pedestals without even questioning it. How many of us casually say, we're going to Rodney Bay, without ever asking who Rodney was? Admiral George Bridges Rodney defended the interests of plantation owners and profited from systems connected to slavery in the Caribbean. So why are we naming places after people connected to systems that brutalized our ancestors? Why should descendants of enslaved people have to celebrate names tied to their own oppression? To me, that feels like mockery disguised as history, Mr. President. And it goes deeper than just names. Many places in St. Lucia, places we live in, pass through, or communities we even grew up around, were once estate plantations worked by enslaved Africans. Places like Corinth, Bocage, Fodor, Kako, and all others carry history connected to slavery and plantation ownership. The land stayed with the powerful, Mr. President. The wealth stayed with the powerful. And after slavery ended in 1833, the enslaved got nothing, while many slave owners were financially compensated and still allowed to keep their estates and their land. So let me ask this. If slavery really ended, why is land ownership still so difficult for the average person? Because Earth has enough land that mathematically, each person could theoretically receive at least 4.4 acres, each, if divided equally. Yet how many regular people actually own land in their name? Especially young people. Why is owning land treated like a luxury instead of a basic part of stability and survival? And people will say, oh, the banks are just doing their due diligence. But why does the system make land so difficult to access in the first place? Why are so many people trapped working 9-to-5 jobs their entire lives just to barely survive? Why does it feel like everything, land, housing, education, healthcare, food, and opportunity, is controlled through systems that keep ordinary people struggling while wealth stays concentrated at the top? And let's not pretend St. Lucia does not have a hierarchy when it comes to wealth. Everybody knows the top names. Everybody knows certain families and groups have had access to more land, more business opportunities, more influence, more opportunities, and more financial security for generations. Inequality did not happen naturally. I repeat, inequality did not happen naturally. These inequalities were built through systems created during slavery and colonialism. And many of those systems still benefit people while disadvantaging others today. We speak constantly about government debt, national struggles, housing crises, unemployment, and economic hardship. But what about the debt inherited through slavery? What about generations who built wealth for empires while leaving their descendants with poverty, trauma, and disadvantage instead? What about that? They say slavery has ended, but are we really free, or has it simply changed form? Mr. President, if wealth can be inherited from generations, then so can the consequences of injustice. And don't get me wrong, I am not saying an apology is magically going to erase slavery. It cannot erase the whips, the tortures, the screams, the cries, the pain, the stolen identities, the broken families, the trauma, the poverty, the abuse, or the generations that suffered afterwards. And I'm not saying financial compensation can ever fully make up for what happened either. But what reparations can do is acknowledge measurable harm, unpaid labor, stolen opportunity, and generational damage. It can alleviate burdens. It can show remorse. It can show accountability. And be clear, reparations are not gifts. Reparations are not handouts. They are acknowledgement and compensation for injustice. And let us stop acting as the reparations are some impossible or ridiculous concept. Reparation is not new. After the Holocaust, compensation and restitution efforts were made towards survivors and victims' families. Indigenous communities across different countries have also fought for land injustice, compensation, and recognition. So if justice can be discussed for others, why is it suddenly too much when descendants of enslaved Africans ask for the same acknowledgement? Kisano Pamun? Even movements for black repatriation and reparatory justice existed long after slavery. Leaders and activists spoke for decades about restoring dignity, opportunity, land, and identity to descendants of enslaved people. Because deep down, people understood something important. Slavery did not end in one day just because the law changed. The consequences stayed behind. Reparatory justice can look like many things: financial compensation, debt relief, better healthcare systems, easier land access, educational opportunities, community investments, cultural restoration, housing support, and official apologies. Because the truth is, again, like I said, inequality did not happen naturally. These inequalities were built through systems created during slavery and colonialism, and justice still matters today. And Mr. President, I anticipate that the opposition may try to distract this House by pointing to modern examples of injustice, inequality, or failures within society today. But Mr. President, that argument actually strengthens the motion instead of weakening it. Because reparatory justice exists precisely because injustice did not disappear. We are not arguing that justice has already been perfected. We are arguing that historical damage still requires acknowledgement and repair. The existence of unresolved justice today is not evidence against reparatory justice. It is evidence for why justice still matters. And if the opposition is still going to talk about injustice in St. Lucia, we literally just saw proof of justice recently here in St. Lucia when Justice Alvin Parson awarded millions in damages to Francis Noel and Anthony Henry after decades of unlawful detention by the state. Francis Noel, for one, was awarded over EC 1.5 million in compensatory damages because the court recognized that injustice deserves accountability. That case reminds me of something important. Justice may be delayed, but people still deserve acknowledgement when harm has been done. Despite the bad, there is good. So when there is good, say there is good. Reparatory justice is not about revenge. It's about repair. It is about recognizing that generations of people built wealth, countries, and empires through forced labor and suffering, while their descendants inherited struggle instead. And if we truly want to reduce inequality, heal historical wounds, improve unity, and create fairer opportunities for future generations, then we cannot keep pretending the conversation about reparations is unreasonable. And furthermore, let me be clear, Mr. President, this motion is not about hatred, discrimination, or priority towards any race. It is about confronting systems and histories that created measurable inequality. So after everything I have said, the inherited trauma, the inherited diseases, the inherited poverty, the normalized abuse, the economic inequality, the land struggles, the systems built during slavery that still affect us today. I ask one final time, Mr. President. They say slavery has ended, but are we really free, or has it simply changed form? I thank you.
Honorable Senators, the question is 1. Calls for the full and unreserved implementation of the CARICOM 10-point plan. 2. Urges the government of St. Lucia to explore avenues of reparation from the British, French, relating to the enduring socio-economic and environmental impacts of slavery and colonialism, including climate vulnerability. 3. Recommends the established National Reparations Committee coordinate all research, policy, and advocacy efforts on behalf of the government of St. Lucia. 4. Supports the development of legislation to govern transparent management of any reparations resources. 5. Calls for the comprehensive education reform to include African and Caribbean history, cultural identity, and reparations awareness within schools' curricula. 6. Encourages national public education campaigns to raise awareness about the legal enslavement and its modern-day impacts. 7. Promotes the youth engagement and leadership in reparations advocacy and decision-making process. 8. Supports the creating of funding mechanisms to invest in community development, education, youth empowerment initiatives. 9. Encourages St. Lucia's foreign policy to align with regional and international efforts advocating for reparatory justice. And be it further resolved that the reparatory justice is a moral, legal, and historical obligation owed to the people of St. Lucia and the wider Caribbean. Senator Alexander, Leader of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good day to you, to the members of this Honorable Senate, and to the listening public. Mr. President, my presence on this floor today is entirely grounded in the Mikud Secondary School, and I want to start off by sending a proud shout-out to my students, as well as the staff of the Mikud Secondary School. It is with their future in mind, however, that I sat here today and yesterday and listened intently to the presentation so far. The leader of government's business poise and confidence must be commended. And let us be realistic here. The government's confidence is warranted. I mean, with 5 government senators, 2 independent senators, and 3 opposition senators, the battle seems already won, no? But I rise here today to shatter the comfort this government seems to have found in a motion that can only be described as less in mediocrity. Because when it comes to matters involving our identity, our history, and the blood of our ancestors, Mr. President, that is not something to play with. And it is for this reason I refuse to let it be reduced to a political game of numbers. The trauma of the Middle Passage cannot be whipped by party lines, and the agony of the plantation cannot be settled by a simple show of hands. Now, my colleagues have reiterated on numerous occasions what our stance is on reparations, but I will risk sounding like a broken record, because it seems between yesterday and today, the government is arguing with themselves. We, the opposition, do not oppose reparations. Reparatory justice is not up for debate. It is a must. In fact, I will go further to say, anyone who opposes reparatory justice does not have a patriotic bone in their body, nor do they understand the true injustices that were done to our ancestors. So, Mr. President, we are not fighting against reparations. But it is also for this reason, it goes against every single cell in my body to stand in this honorable house and let a piece of legislation riddled with loopholes pass through without shedding light on the issues. No individual who has this nation's best interests at heart will sit and let its own people do an injustice to the history that shaped it. This motion is not just a representation of our past. It is a vision for our future. And if we are going to do something, let us do it right. And doing it right, Mr. President, means looking at this text with clear eyes. The sheer impracticality of how this framework is structured makes it logistically hollow from the top. A king never marches into battle unprepared just because he is angry or because it is an emotional situation. He ensures his armor is tested, his soldiers are equipped, and his strategy is flawless. We are a tiny nation on the geopolitical ocean. That is true. But that is more of a reason why when we step on that global floor, we come laden with bulletproof armor. We cannot match the world in military might or financial wealth. So our intellect, our policy, and our legislation must be twice as sharp. It must be twice as precise, and it must be completely unbreakable. Now I am not going to strip my colleagues of their thunder. The two capable senators sitting right here are going to fully dismantle the operational and practical flaws. But let it be noted from the onset that this current plan is not workable. Now, Mr. President, throughout yesterday's session and today's session, I sat in the chamber and listened to the government benches give grand sweeping lectures on the historical horrors of slavery. They cited the Barbados Slave Code of 1661 and painted vivid emotional pictures of our ancestors being branded like livestock. I feel the profound weight of that history in the core of my being. But I refuse to stand here today and repeat the same history lessons we were given yesterday and today. I refuse to use the trauma of our ancestors as a sort of performance or reduce their suffering to a political prop used to blind the public to a weak piece of policy. Yes, the government is doing an exceptional job in talking about the backdrop of the motion, but they are completely failing to justify the actual text of the motion lying on this table before us. You are supporting the reasons for reparations, which we all agree on. Nobody in the opposition is denying that we have reason for reparations. But you are completely failing to defend the actual mechanics of the motion you have put before us. Yesterday, a minister stood up and lamented that our children in St. Lucia can list more British monarchs than our national heroes, using that tragic reality to justify this motion. Well, I have a direct question. You guys are the government right now. You control the state right now. So why hasn't the history curriculum expansion already started? According to regional educational data from CXC, less than 15% of secondary school students leave our school systems with a comprehensive formalized mastery of West Indian history. So I ask a question to you. Is our ancestral identity only valuable to you when you need it as an emotional shield to push a vague piece of paper through Parliament? Or do you truly believe that you lack the power to transform our schools unless you get a payout from Europe? Yesterday, they stood before us and argued that the soft, passive phrasing within this text, specifically the words "explore avenues," is entirely justified because development must happen in multiple phases. They essentially claim that the opposition is wrong for demanding that these avenues be clearly defined before the motion is delivered. Mr. President, what kind of upside down logic is that? So because this document has intent, we the opposition should not question the clarity behind it? Let me ask you a question. If an architect brings you a blueprint for your family home with missing structural beams, do you just sign your name and hand over your life savings because he says, don't worry, we will tell you more about it in phase 3? Do you even know what phase 3 is? If you sign off on a broken blueprint, the roof will fall on your head. The government proudly asserted that this motion is a necessary stepping stone for our nation. But when I look at the ambiguous phrasing and corporate language in this motion, I see that this stone is exceptionally slippery. And me and my opposition members are afraid to slip and bruise our knees. The government further attempted a diplomatic scare tactic, claiming that if we, the opposition, question this local text, we are threatening to break ranks with CARICOM and weakening our region's global leverage. Let me strike down that argument immediately. No one on this side of the floor has ever insinuated that St. Lucia should detach from the CARICOM framework. That is a textbook fabrication designed to shift the focus away from the poor drafting of this motion. A regional guide is a compass, but a local motion must be precise. You cannot simply copy and paste a regional wish list and call it a localized war-ready plan of action. And Mr. President, let us inject some hard, uncomfortable economic facts into this room to counter the superficial narratives being spun across this floor. Look at the phrasing of this motion. We use soft words like urge, recommend, encourage, and explore. This passive language forces St. Lucia into a submissive posture on the global stage, making it look as though we are begging Europe for a favor. I stand here to remind this House that St. Lucians do not beg. Reparations are an absolute, non-negotiable sovereign right. Now, they will argue and say that we are not waiting on Europe to initiate local development, but rather hoping that this external framework will improve and continue the work that has already started. But, Mr. President, if this funding is meant to scale up an existing foundation, then we have a duty to look at the absolute state of the foundation we have today, right? If you are already doing the work, why is the current machinery starved of resources? And why must our local institutions survive on crumbs while we wait for an upgrade from Europe? Mr. President, Matthew chapter 7 verses 24 to 27 reminds us that the wise man builds his house upon the rock so that when the floods hit, the structure stands firm. But the foolish man builds his house on the sand without a foundation. Waiting on a European check is like building one's house on sand. The foundation is shaky and the integrity of the house is beyond questionable. Look at the absolute irony of this administration's version of sovereignty, where we stand in this chamber boasting about running our own affairs while allowing European powers to openly dictate our internal domestic policies. Year after year, the European Union unilaterally places Caribbean nations on its arbitrary tax blacklist of non-cooperative jurisdictions. This cripples our financial services, which accounts for a massive portion of our GDP. Our sovereign Caribbean governments are forced to scramble, alter our domestic financial structures, and change our internal tax laws just to avoid their devastating economic sanctions. They are still managing our economic borders from across the Atlantic. Yet instead of focusing our collective legislative energy on making our existing local budget completely bulletproof, this government designs a passive framework that treats national development like a lottery ticket. You cannot talk about improving a system tomorrow when you are actively neglecting and underfunding that system today. This legislation approaches international diplomacy on its knees, but St. Lucia must stand tall, mandate, and demand what is rightfully ours. Now, Mr. President, before I proceed, let me explicitly outline the structural connection between the motion on the table and the governance culture of this administration. The vague, submissive language within the motion is not an accident. It is a direct reflection of the institutional philosophy that dictates how this government operates both on paper and on the floor. We saw a clear display of this philosophy, where a member attempted to frame this entire debate to make it seem as though the opposition is acting purely out of partisan convenience. They have deliberately tried to construct a toxic, manipulative atmosphere in this parliament by weaponizing the heavy emotion of slavery. Yo vle moun kwe opposition ni a obligation pour assise. Pela ek suiv tout sa yo di konja ki pan kakachile pou koyo. They want people to believe the opposition has a moral obligation to sit down, close our mouth, and blindly follow everything they say, like people who cannot think for ourselves. They want to breed a mindset where questioning the text of a motion is framed as a betrayal of our ancestors by preaching about a united front to silence legitimate critique. I entirely agree with the principle of a united front, but a united front built on blind obedience is not a democracy. It is a cult of political convenience. What kind of united front blindly follows an incomplete plan without asking a single question, clarifying a single loophole, or trying to strengthen areas of blatant risk? Are we trying to establish a precedent where we systematically silence and shut down youth voices the moment they do not align with the ruling elite? And this brings us directly to some of the behaviors witnessed so far. First and foremost, why is this resolution written with such vague, submissive words when it comes to our youth, our culture, and our education? It is because this government operates on a dangerous institutional philosophy that says, we have the majority, we have the numbers, therefore, we do not owe you an explanation. When we look at how dissenting voices are usually treated in this room, it matches the same lazy energy of this motion. Shows a pattern where the government treats honest feedback like a nuisance instead of a helpful tool. And Mr. President, let us speak the raw truth. The physical shackles are indeed gone. The whips are gone. And the overseers are in the history books. That is true. Yet, I see a deeply rooted, highly sophisticated, plantation-guided mindset alive and well in how this modern administration operates. The slave slavery has ended, but are we really free? Or has it just changed forms? You are telling the opposition the same thing this motion tells the citizens of St. Lucia. Stay silent, don't talk, the ayes have it, and do not question the masters of this house. You sound exactly like our historical oppressors when you stand on this floor and tell young leaders that we have no right to criticize the blueprint just because you possess the raw political power to force it down our throats. C'est pas ça Petronil te goumet pou. That is not what Petronil fought for. Multiple members stood up yesterday and proudly called the name of Petronil Dwayne to give themselves unearned moral authority. How dare you use the sacred name of Petronil to justify a text that settles for passive language, while you simultaneously use silencing tactics on this floor to choke out voices? How can you claim to honor her memory when you act like the overseer she died resisting? True education means teaching our young people to question authority where it matters, not shutting them down when they expose your mediocrity. If Petronil Dwayne was standing here in this chamber today, she would not be voting for a text built on blind trust and submissive language. She would be standing right here on the opposition benches, demanding strength, demanding precision, and standing in total unyielding defiance. And Mr. President, this brings us to the core structural catastrophe of this entire resolution. motion. My apologies. The government wants the public to believe that if we just pass this paper and wait for these undefined avenues of European funding, our social issues will magically vanish. They talk about building monuments, creating museums, and transforming communities. But I ask this House a fundamental question of architectural reality. Kimanye, zot ka bati kaila, me zot ka kase potoa. How are y'all building the house and y'all breaking the very pillars that are supposed to hold it up? Mr. President, the youth of St. Lucia, our local community, our parliamentary democracy, and the independent voices of this house are those pillars. When you use your majority to silence the differing views, you are chopping down the very pillars of this nation. How can you honestly claim you are constructing a proud sovereign future when you are actively breaking the spirits of the young people who are supposed to inherit it? And look at the hypocrisy on the ground. This administration expects district youth and sports councils to execute programs in order to desensitize the youth about this motion. Yet those same exact DYCs are left to starve and struggle for a single dollar of basic operational resources. You throw them massive structural responsibilities, but where are the financial tools to succeed? And let us play out. Let's just say Europe feels a sudden wave of guilt, signs a check, and millions of dollars are poured into our national accounts tomorrow morning. What then? You can bring all the wealth in the world across the Atlantic Ocean. But if you have already conditioned your young people to stay silent, accept mediocrity, and bow down to political intimidation, that wealth will leak straight through the cracks of a broken, stifled society. Money cannot heal a vessel that is actively being broken on the inside. This submissive policy reminds me of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's classic novel, El Colonel no tiene quien le escriba, or No One Writes to the Colonel. It is a tragic story of an old veteran who spends every single Friday standing on the docks, starving and waiting for a letter with a pension that is never going to come. Mr. President, this government has turned St. Lucia into that tragic colonel. You are letting our institutions starve and our history curriculums rot today while you stand passively by the global docks waiting for a financial letter from Europe tomorrow. When it comes to setting up complex financial frameworks and corporate structures to manage assets, this motion is written with sharp, strict black and white legal rules. But the moment this text mentions our youth, our education, and our identity, the government suddenly switches to soft, submissive language. Do not stand here and tell our young people that a corporate financial framework is a guaranteed certainty, but their identity, their voices, and their community spaces are a soft gamble we must look into later. Therefore, we demand an immediate structural change to this motion to shift from this passive posture. If this motion can have strict legal teeth to protect corporate asset structures, it must have the same strict legal teeth to protect our youth. We demand permanent uncuttable subventions for councils and the immediate universal funding of our localized St. Lucia history curriculums across every single secondary school. We are not asking for permission to survive. We are mandating our future as a sovereign state. Now, Mr. President, as I draw to a close, let history record that when this motion came before the Senate, the opposition did not stand in the way of reparatory justice. We stood in the way of administrative laziness and refused to sit silently and watch our ancestral identity be reduced to a commercial marketplace transaction just to maintain a comfortable negative peace. And Martin Luther King further supports this by stating, true peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice. Now, the structural and moral choice rests entirely on the government benches. And I know the honorable members of this House may remember my words clearly from last year when I stated, standing on this side, If you can't give meaningful contributions to an already pre-coded solution, then respectfully, your presence in this honorable house holds very little meaning. Mr. President, I am holding myself to my own standard today. I have not given you an emotional performance. I have led meaningful, structural, war-ready recommendations on this floor to protect the sovereignty of our people. If this government chooses to ignore these amendments simply because party lines dictate it, if you choose to vote for a lazy, copy and paste watered down wish list because you think your numerical majority gives you the right to ignore the youth, you are proving my words true. You are proving to every young person watching this live stream that your presence in this chamber today holds no structural meaning at all. You may have the temporary power to force the vote. You may have the numbers to command this room, but the true moral authority rests right here on this side of the floor. Mr. President, I thank you.
Senator Regis.
Mr. President, colleagues, I would first like to bid you a good day, as I am also having on account of this motion. Fanon said in his novel, Black Skin, White Mask, make people aware of the possibilities they have denied themselves or the passiveness they have displayed in situations where it was really necessary to do otherwise. And members, this is my intention today as I stand before you and speak in support of this literature entitled the Repertory Justice Resolution 2026. Mr. President, I would like to begin by stating a few points as a matter of fact. Firstly, that this motion, which by definition is a formal proposal, does not follow the formatting of a suggested policy. And I believe this is interpretable by members of the Senate who have directed their attention to the actual matter at hand and not the pageantry and technicality of literature, which, might I add, is a tactic of colonialism used multiple times to silence our ancestors. And for the purpose of mutual understanding on all fronts, according to the United Nations, reparations refers to measures to redress violations of human rights by providing a range of material and symbolic benefits to victims or their families, as well as affected communities. Reparation must be adequate, effective, prompt, and should be proportional to the gravity of the violations and the harm suffered. And according to the Repair Campaign, reparations describe how an individual, group, or society attempts to remedy a wrongdoing or crime. Reparations are not just financial compensation, and they also include, but are not limited to, formal apologies, return of colonized land and artifacts, restitution of civil rights, and processes of memorialization. With this out of the way, Mr. President, I believe we can continue with the assurance that there is common ground between our own interests and the understanding of the United Nations on a similar front. I would like to begin by dissecting the use of redress and remedy in the sphere of law, specifically in cases of exoneration. When a crime is struck off the books or legislation is changed in favor of individuals who previously suffered at the hands of it, it is typically followed by the pursuit of damages in instances where said crime was deemed unconstitutional from its inception. Mr. President, I would like to use a similar reasoning in regard to reparatory justice. Taking into consideration decisions the United Nations have made, including deeming the transatlantic slave trade the gravest crime against humanity, dwell on that, and slavery in and of itself a crime against humanity that should have always been deemed as such. Wouldn't this on its own substantiate its illegality from inception? Wouldn't this also substantiate our desire to pursue reparatory justice for our nation and our people? This is our quality of life, and the youth who will be born into it. It would be remiss not to. Reparations have been sought and paid out for similar humanitarian tragedies, some of which you may be familiar with, such as World War I and II, where upwards of 200 billion liquidated have been paid out. Or perhaps, Mr. President, an even more localized instance of reparations being paid out would suffice. I would like to resurface with the addition of figures. I raise you 20 million pounds sterling paid to enslavers in 1843 following abolition, which, as you have been told, accounted for 40% of Britain's national budget that year.
Honourable Member, from what credibility you quoting that?
Beg your pardon?
The figures you're quoting from?
It's from online, it's public information.
Oh, because we would need the source to make sure it's credible. But may continue.
As you have been told, this 20 million pounds sterling accounted for 40% of Britain's national budget that year. A detail I included to point out the insistence from enslavers to receive their compensation, regardless of the economic ramifications on their own country, and also of the government to make allowances for the aggrieved groups who matter to them. Britain has recovered, Mr. President, but this growth did not arrive overnight. It is a result of the right investments at the right time. That is, during the Industrial Revolution, where our ancestors were considered subhuman and stripped of an opportunity to make it in the world, to leave a legacy for us, their descendants. A time period where they were stuck serving the interests of Europe and its insatiable appetite for expansion. Today, Britain's national budget is inconceivable. Members of the House, the figures are life-changing, and I would never stand in opposition to an investment that could permanently and insurmountably change the trajectory of our lives in the Caribbean. Walcott said, "In our own entrails, Genesis." Yet, how are we supposed to pursue Genesis without any resources? Might I state with finality that it is not charity, it is not pity, it is a reimbursement for 400 years of suffering and exploitation. Regardless, why is it only framed this way when it comes to our reparatory justice? Mr. President, why should France bleed Haiti with little to no discourse, yet we do not deserve the same courtesy? Why is it that we do not deserve the same reparation? Why buy into this notion despite our better judgment? Why is it that these giants found the need for reparation after already stripping us of our wealth and our resources? It is time for us to adopt a similar mindset. Let it not be forgotten that despite emancipation and independence being, without the shadow of a doubt, the best case scenario, it was not made without being advantageous to England and France. This humanitarian crisis only pulled their heartstrings when it dared affect their enterprise. Mr. President, what of our own enterprise? It is our duty to have a similar, if not a deeper passion and drive to receive our own repertory justice here in the Caribbean. It is our duty to be unwavering and staunch in our resolve to push back against any and all forces inhibiting us from meeting this goal. I believe this bill is a step in the right direction to seek redress for systematic disadvantages that we should not have had to grapple with in the first instance. Disadvantages such as a public health crisis, worded wonderfully in CARICOM's 10-point plan. The African-descended population here in the Caribbean has the highest incidence in the world of chronic diseases in the forms of hypertension and type 2 diabetes. A direct result of the nutritional experience, physical and emotional brutality, and overall stress profiles associated with slavery, genocide, and apartheid. Wealth and land inequality. While the enslavers were compensated following abolition, the enslaved were dispelled with nothing. Emancipation did not bring forth land redistribution. We could say 99% of the land was still owned by 1% of the population. Just further opportunities for the colonizers to benefit at the hands of the enslaved. And finally, in the interest of time, an illiteracy crisis, wherein at the end of the European colonial period, in most parts of the Caribbean, the British in particular left the black and indigenous communities in a general state of illiteracy. Some 70% of blacks in British colonies were functionally illiterate in the 1960s when nation states began to appear. Members of the House, I have only touched on 3 factions of society, but might I be permitted to say the most important: health, wealth, and education. It is by our own ingenuity that we have been able to rise from the ashes of this heinous past and create something beautiful. But I dare say, do not let this prevent you from striving for more, for better. Through the implementation of this resolution, we are making improvements to our own society regardless. This motion stands as a declaration by our own government and nation that we will not sit back and allow our oppressors to move on without retribution. This motion stands as the framework whereby we shall be able to move forward and create the institutions necessary for change. Furthermore, members of the opposition, do you believe that our people, the government, the reparations committee do not have the coordination and drive to continually ensure that all stakeholders are held accountable? Why look at the worst case scenario? Mr. President, while it has been argued that the document was not thoroughly prepared, I repeat, this document sets the framework for institutions which will be furnished with all the preparedness to formidably make a case for reparations. This resolution sets the pace for the journey. How are we supposed to test our armor if we are afraid to take the first step? Numbers 3, 4, and 8 all advocate for structures which will serve us during this process, and even more so If reparations are granted by the enslavers, we would be prepared to receive, document, redistribute all investments made into our island seamlessly and effectively. Disregarding all this, it would facilitate the training of individuals into skilled work, dealing with research, policy, advocacy, as well as public education and the delegation of resources. In regard to number 5, as it stands, the education of the primary school child in the realm of Caribbean history and the misdeeds of European powers is insufficient. It is alive and well in our secondary school curriculum, but this may not be an option for the majority of students can explore due to what is being offered at their respective secondary schools. History is a driving force and one of our only agents of instilling a uniquely Caribbean identity and consciousness in the minds of our youth. Harnessing this passion from a young age primes the children of our nation with the knowledge necessary to move in the world as change agents and continue the legacy of fighting for our systematic freedom. In the modern era, especially against the grips of globalization and a disconnect from their roots. Members of the Senate,
Senator,
I hope you have been made aware.
You have 5 more minutes.
Members of the Senate, I hope you have been made aware of the possibilities we would deny ourselves should we negate pursuing this resolution, and the passiveness we are displaying in this situation should we not take action where it benefits our own interests. It is of utmost importance that in this geopolitical era, we look out for our own interests regionally and stand in solidarity with our fellow members of CARICOM as an immovable force, further explored in number 9 of the resolution, where we deliberately make the coordinated effort to rework our foreign policy and fight to be compensated. In the event that this resolution is accepted, I believe we will be acting in accordance with this. Mr. President, this is not a game of cards. It is your life and mine. I thank you.
Senator Edward.
Mr. President, honorable members of this House, distinguished colleagues, fellow St. Lucians in the gallery and watching online, good day. I rise today in full support of this motion on repatriatory justice for the people of St. Lucia and the wider Caribbean. And permit me to begin with the profound words of Jamaican politician, activist Marcus Garvey. A people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. Mr. President, those words are not simply symbolic. They are a warning. A nation that forgets its history risks normalizing injustice and misunderstanding the realities that continue to shape its society today. As we say in Creole, "Ça qui passe, pas mort." What has happened is not dead. This motion before this honorable House is not about division, vengeance, or hostility toward modern Europe. Rather, it is about truth, justice, and above all, historical accountability. Mr. President, the history of St. Lucia is inseparable from the brutal legacy of colonialism and slavery. The scale of this injustice cannot be understated. According to the United Nations 2024, for over 4 centuries, more than 15 million Africans were forcibly trafficked across the Atlantic under the transatlantic slave trade, while approximately 2 million perished during the journey. Thousands of these enslaved Africans were subsequently transported to St. Lucia. Our island was fought over 14 times by the British and the French. 7 times we were British and 7 times French. Yet, despite the change in colonial powers, the suffering of enslaved Africans remained constant. Different flags flew above this island, but the exploitation endured. The enslaved were forced to labor on plantations under conditions so horrific and brutal that generations of Caribbean people continue to experience the lasting effects centuries later through cultural displacement, health challenges, climate vulnerability, and the enduring psychological scars of colonialism. The historical record confirms that the Barbados Slave Code of 1661 legally classified African people as chattel, as property rather than human beings. Imagine that, Mr. President. Human beings stripped of identity, human beings denied liberty, human beings bought and sold under law. As we debate this motion today, we must remember that these descendants of the enslaved are not distant figures confined to history books. They are our neighbors in Grozile, our fishermen in Labrie, our farmers in Choiseul, our parents, and young people throughout this nation. The enslaved were not statistics within colonial records. They were men, women, and children with families, cultures, ambitions, and dignity. Indeed, they could very well have been us, had history unfolded differently. Any one of us in this chamber today could have been forced into chains, displaced from our homeland, separated from our families, and subjected to the brutality of plantation slavery. Mr. President, no reasonable society can examine that history honestly and deny that repatriatory justice is morally justified. The wealth generated through slavery financed the economic growth of European empires. Caribbean sugar plantations enriched Britain and France, while simultaneously creating systems of dependency and underdevelopment throughout this region. According to the dependency theory formulated by Andre Gander Frank, within the global economic structure, European powers emerged as core nations, producing and controlling finished goods, while Caribbean colonies such as St. Lucia were reduced to peripheral economies primarily exploited for raw materials, agricultural production, and cheap labor. As a result, the Caribbean developed in a manner that benefited colonial powers, helped finance the Industrial Revolution, and the expansion of European economies rather than the people of the Caribbean. Meanwhile, the same industrial expansion financed through enslaved labor also contributed to the patterns of environmental exploitation and industrial development that continue to fuel global climate crisis today. A crisis that disproportionately threatens small island developing states such as St. Lucia. Through rising sea levels, coastal erosion, and the intensified natural disasters, these patterns of dependency were later examined extensively by Caribbean economists and scholars. Nobel laureate Sir Arthur Lewis, in his work, Labor in the West Indies, examined the exploitative labor structures created during colonialism and their long-term developmental consequences for Caribbean societies. His work later informed many of the principles now reflected within the CARICOM repatriations framework. Mr. President, some critics argue that slavery occurred centuries ago, and therefore repatriations should no longer be discussed. But let us be clear, the effects of slavery did not end at emancipation. Professor Hilary Beckles, chair of the CARICOM Repatriations Commission and renowned historian, explicitly made a link between slavery and diabetes in the Caribbean. According to him, there is a historical connection between Caribbean slavery and modern rates of chronic diseases such as type 2 diabetes and hypertension. Beckles has said that the diet, stress, brutality, and living conditions imposed during slavery created lasting biological and social consequences. For example, in a 2016 speech reported by the Jamaica Gleaner, Beckles argued that enslaved Africans in the Caribbean were forced into diets heavy in sugar, saltfish, and the salted pork on sugar plantation for centuries, and he linked that history to today's diabetes and hypertension. The consequences remain visible today in economic inequality, generational poverty, land ownership disparities, educational limitations, and the persistent underdevelopment of former colonies. If nations continue to benefit from wealth accumulated through slavery, then they cannot selectively detach themselves from the responsibility associated with that history. One cannot inherit the benefits of history while denying responsibility for the suffering that produced those benefits. Mr. President, some may also attempt to diminish the call for repatriatory justice by arguing that Africans themselves participated in the slave trade. However, in nearly every oppressive system throughout history, there have been individuals who complied under coercion, need for survival, manipulation, and political pressure. Therefore, the existence of intermediaries does not erase the moral and historical responsibility of the empires that transformed human trafficking into one of the largest and most profitable systems of exploitation that the world has ever seen. Mr. President, perhaps one of the greatest injustices following emancipation was the fact that compensation was not paid to the enslaved, but to the enslavers. Under the Slavery Abolition Act, 1843, enslavers across the British Empire, including within St. Lucia, received financial compensation for the loss of what they considered as property. The formerly enslaved received freedom without land, without economic support, and without repatriative measures. And notably, the British government loan used to compensate enslavers was only fully paid in 2015. 2015, Mr. President. This demonstrates that the economic legacy of slavery is not ancient history. Its financial consequences extended into the modern era. Mr. President, repatriatory justice is not unprecedented. Following the Holocaust, repatriations were paid to Jewish survivors and descendants because the international community recognized that crimes against humanity require acknowledgement and repair. Likewise, the United Nations has declared slavery and the slave trade to be crimes against humanity. More recently, on March 25th, 2026, the United Nations General Assembly acknowledged the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans, rationalized chattel slavery, as among the gravest crimes against humanity. Mr. President, repatriations must also be understood beyond direct compensation. The CARICOM 10-point plan advocates for educational reform, psychological rehabilitation, cultural restoration, public health initiative, technological development, and the investment in Caribbean communities. This is about repairing systems damaged through centuries of exploitation. And this motion wisely recognizes the importance of education. Our young people must understand African and Caribbean history fully and honestly. They must know not only the brutality of slavery, but also the resilience and resistance of our ancestors. Mr. President, Saki Pase Pam. Mr. President, even today, many people continue to recognize unequal global relations rooted in colonial history. The recent visa restrictions introduced by the United Kingdom in 2026 has sparked concerns throughout the region, particularly among descendants of people whose labor contributed significantly to Britain's development. How ironic. These realities remind us that colonialism was not merely historical. Its effects continue to shape international relations and economic realities today. Mr. President, Marcus Garvey once argued that compensation for the crimes of slavery should amount to trillions because of the immeasurable wealth extracted from African people and Caribbean societies. And while no amount of money can fully compensate for the suffering endured by our ancestors, acknowledgement and repair remain necessary. This plan, therefore, represents an important step toward recognition, repair, and regional dignity. Mr. President, our ancestors survived one of the darkest systems in human history. Yet, despite the centuries of exploitation and displacement, the enslaved people of St. Lucia and the wider Caribbean demonstrated extraordinary resilience. Colonialism attempted to suppress African identity, erase culture, and fragment communities. Yet, our ancestors preserved language, spirituality, music, oral tradition, and the resistance against tremendous odds. We owe them remembrance, we owe them truth, and we owe them justice. I therefore fully support this motion and urge all honorable members of this House to do likewise. So today, Mr. President, we are reminded once more, ça qui passe, pamo, and that repatriatory justice is moral, legal, and historical obligation owed to the people of St. Lucia and the wider Caribbean. Thank you.
Senator Daniel.
Mr. President, honorable senators, distinguished guests, and my fellow young St. Lucians, I rise today not as a politician performing outrage. I rise as a young person who has sat with this question, not in textbooks, but in the reality of what it means to be St. Lucian. To walk down the hills of Castries and to know that the land beneath our feet was once watered by the blood and sweat of the people who were not permitted to own it. To understand that the poverty, the inequality, and the gaps in our healthcare and our schools, these are not accidents of nature. They are inheritances of a system designed to extract, diminish, and to forget. So let me be absolutely clear before I say another word. Reparatory justice is owed to the people of St. Lucia. The opposition does not dispute that. We do not minimize the horrors of chattel slavery or the violence of colonialism. We do not stand on the wrong side of history. What we are asking, what we are demanding is that the government offer St. Lucia not just a righteous cause, but a realistic St. Lucia-centered plan to pursue it. Because our ancestors deserve better than slavery, and their descendants deserve better than symbolism. Mr. President, St. Lucia is a unique in the Caribbean. Ours is an island that has changed hands between the British and the French no fewer than 14 times. We were enslaved under both flags. Our people bore the brutality of two empires. Our Creole language, our culture, our very identity, these were forged in resistance to colonial erasure. So when the CARICOM Reparations Commission tells us that the transatlantic slave trade was the largest forced migration in human history, we in St. Lucia do not need to be convinced. And as my lovely senator mentioned before, and I would love to bring this up, when Professor Sir Hilary Beckles speaks of a wall of solemn silence that European governments have used to fend off reparations claims since 2001, We do not find that hard to believe. And the momentum is real. At the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Apia, Samoa in October 2024, leaders formally endorsed language recognizing transatlantic slavery as a crime against humanity and agreed, in their own words, that the time has come for a meaningful, truthful, and respectful conversation. The CARICOM 10-point plan, first adopted in 2014 and recently revised to reflect new evidence, continues to guide negotiations with our European nations. The African Union designated 2025 as the year of justice for Africans and the people of African descent through reparations. The tide is turning. We acknowledge all of this. We celebrate this momentum. The opposition stands behind the moral foundation of this cause. But, Mr. President, momentum and a plan are not the same thing. And this is where we must be honest with the people of St. Lucia. Let us speak plainly about Britain. A 2025 poll commissioned by the Repair Campaign, an organization actively supporting reparations cause, found that 85% of the UK adults were unaware that Britain forcibly transported over 3 million Africans throughout the Caribbean. 89% did not know that Britain enslaved people here for more than 300 years. And while 63% of UK adults now support a formal apology, support for financial reparations stands at 40%. That number is growing, yes. But neither major political party in the United Kingdom has committed to financial reparations. Reparations, as the Times of London reported last year, are not on the agenda. And France's own Supreme Court recently rejected a request for reparations for slavery in Martinique, ruling that no one had demonstrated individual harm from crimes suffered by their ancestors. French courts have consistently rejected reparations claims. The plaintiffs have had to appeal to the European courts, the European Courts of Human Rights, just to keep the case alive. The opposition asks, respectfully but firmly, given this reality, given this entrenched resistance, what is the government's contingency plan? What happens if Britain and France continue to say no? What happens to the St. Lucian farmer in the valley, the mothers and daughters of Monrepo, and the fisheries hustlers by the seaside if 5 years from now the answer from London and Paris is still silence? We are not saying reparations are impossible. We are saying that a strategy built almost entirely on the goodwill of former colonial power is at best optimistic, and at worst a way of telling our people that their future depends on the generosity of those who built their wealth on our suffering. Is that the independence we fought for? Mr. President, the CARICOM 10-point plan is admirable. It calls for a formal apology, for debt cancellation, for cultural institutions, for educational reform, for repatriation programs. It is comprehensive, and it reflects decades of scholarship and advocacy. The opposition respects it. But a regional framework is not a national strategy. And St. Lucia, our St. Lucia, cannot afford to wait for 14 other nations to align their priorities before we begin our own internal work. We have a National Reparations Committee, and it is only this year, 2026, that the current administration became the first in 3 successive governments to arrange any financial support for the NRC. 3 governments, Mr. President, 3, which, by the way, in case that number seems small to you, is approximately 15 years. And only now, only with the pressure of this debate and this growing regional momentum, has financial support arrived. We are glad it came, but why so late? And what is the plan now that it is here? The NRC is launching art competitions. It is planning community broadcasts. It is reviving reparations lectures. These are all meaningful, truly. But public education alone does not constitute a policy framework. It does not answer the question of, if reparations funds and resources were received tomorrow, which hospitals would be built, which schools would be reformed, what criteria would govern the distribution, who would provide oversight, and which independent body would prevent mismanagement. In St. Lucia, Mr. President, the poorest 20% of our households account for just over 5% of global expenditure. Our income inequality, measured by the Gini coefficient, sits at 51.2, high by both regional and global standards. Just over 1 in 3 St. Lucian children were poor, according to national surveys. These are not statistics to debate. These are lives. And they are lives that will be affected or not affected, depending on whether reparations resources, if ever received, are managed with care, transparency, and clear national strategy. The opposition is not asking for perfection. We are asking for a plan. Mr. President, there is a conversation that we must have. And I say this not to score political points, but because our ancestors demand honesty from us. Reparatory justice is a moral, historical, and legal claim, but reparations, when received, become policy. They become governance. They become the test of whether our institutions are capable of managing resources in the interest of the people, rather than the interest of the powerful. We have seen across the Caribbean and the wider developing world what happens when large inflows of external funding and resources meet weak governance structures. Resources are captured. The people who suffered the most see the least. So the opposition asks, if reparations come, structured not as a lump sum, but as gradual compensation, as the government has acknowledged, what happens when those payments end? If we expand public services on the basis of reparations income, how do we sustain those services when the flow stops? The government has not answered this. And while we speak of colonial injustice, and we should, we must also speak honestly about the injustices we have the power to address today. Crime is rising. Governance gaps are real. These challenges do not diminish the reparations claims, but they are within the government's power to address right now. They should not be deferred to diplomatic negotiations that may take a whole other generation. We can hold two truths at one time. Britain owes us, and we owe ourselves better governments in the meantime. Mr. President, the opposition does not come to this chamber to tear down this motion. We come to make it stronger. On behalf of every St. Lucian who deserves more than good intentions alone, we are calling for a St. Lucia specific implementation plan, not just as endorsement of the CARICOM framework, but a document that answers the specific questions for our specific people. Which communities come first? What are the criteria? And who provides our oversight? We are calling for diversified international partnerships, not dependence on Britain and France alone, but engagement with the African Union, with international courts, and the UN mechanisms now available to us. The 80th UN General Assembly recently adopted a motion designating the trafficking of enslaved Africans as a crime against humanity. These are forums where our cause has traction. We are calling for a true independent governance body to manage any reparations resources. The vague promises in clause 4 of your motion to simply develop legislation is a massive loophole designated for political capture. We demand a body that is fully transparent, with civil society representation, clear criteria for distribution, and ironclad protections against the mismanagements we see today. Mr. President, the government proudly points to clauses 5 and 8 of their motion, calling for curriculum reform and community development, while hiding behind the CARICOM's plan for mental health investments. But let me be clear, these are not items we should be waiting on London or Paris to finance. This internal work must begin right now, funded by domestic prioritization. Do not use historical debts of the British to to excuse your failures to invest in St. Lucian minds and communities today. Mr. President, I think about those who came before us. I think about the men and women who were brought to this island in chains, who were stripped of their names, their languages, and their families, who were told that they were property, who resisted quietly and loudly in the fields and in the hills, who survived, who gave us this island, this language, and this very identity. They did not survive so that we could perform justice. They survived so that we could achieve it. And achieving it, real, lasting structural justice, requires more than a motion that moves us emotionally. It requires rigor. It requires accountability. It requires a plan that does not leave the fate of our people in the hands of those who have already shown us time and again what they think of our claim. The opposition supports reparatory justice. We cannot stress this enough. We have always supported reparatory justice. But what we cannot support, what we will not support, is a path that trades our ancestors' plane for our government symbolism. St. Lucia deserves the real thing. Our people deserve the real thing. And this Senate has the responsibility to demand it. I thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Mooney.
Good morning, Mr. President, senators, spectators and guests, and persons viewing via the live stream. Bienvenue tout le monde, welcome everybody. Let me first start by applauding the government's efforts to seek reparations in St. Lucia, with an excerpt of one of my favorite songs by St. Lucian artist Gabi Gabi. I just want to free my mind with you. While I recognize the necessity for a united regional stance on reparations from the United Kingdom, I believe it is equally important that the declaration includes unique plans for our small island developing state. As we all know, St. Lucia's situation is unlike any other, in that our ancestors were enslaved by both the British and the French regimes many times. The declaration, therefore, Mr. President, must not be treated as a symbolic gesture or a generalized statement of historical grievance. It must be sharpened, refined, and rooted in the lived specificity of our island experience. While the declaration includes both British and French, most documents cited pertain only to the British. This allows the French to slip under the radar. However, they need to be equally accounted for, as they are equally to blame. The Barbados Slave Code of 1661 did not merely regulate slavery. It had transformed human beings into legal property and built a legal foundation for racialized chattel slavery across the British Caribbean, and is mentioned in the declaration. However, the French Code Noir, which is of similar content, makes no appearance. St. Lucia is not simply another post-colonial state in the Caribbean archipelago. It is a territory shaped by dual colonial dominion, repeated conquest, and centuries of shifting ownership between the British and the French. Within these violent exchanges, Mr. President, it was the African women who bore the heaviest weight of survival. With your permission, Mr. President, I will briefly illustrate a day in the life of an enslaved woman using colloquial language. Okay, so my day starts 5 a.m. It's still dark, and it's cold. They're ringing the bell. How loud outside. All now, so my back's still hurting from the licks I take yesterday, but I still have to go and see if I can get something to eat. 6 o'clock, I reach in the kitchen, and it's only cassava they're giving us for breakfast today. After I hate cassava, but it's that or nothing. 7 o'clock, I cannot even well swallow the food. The man already rushing us to the plantation. 8, 9, 10, 11 o'clock, I still cutting cane. All my hands done burning already. It how hot, and the man shouting at us since the time. The cassava don't fool me this morning, you know. I wonder if they will give us lunch today. 12 o'clock, I can finally eat again. Yo, no way is yum they're giving us to eat after all that work. At least they put a little saltfish on the side. Sasale. Not even a 30-minute lunch break. I don't even have a chance to let the ITs take over. And it's not to say they give us nothing much anyways. We're back on the plantation again, right back at it with the cane. Every day, cut and carry cane. Where all the cane coming from? And I have to do that until the sun go down. Finally, sunset, a little ease up for me. My grandmother always have a story to give. We see these same things reflected in our society with the storytelling after a long day. Mr. President, I will speak carefully but truthfully about the realities faced by the African women, but I will shy away from the horrors of the night. Mr. President, African women receive no accommodations. Rather, their strong, deliberately bred figures were treated as masculine, all while being sexualized and sexually assaulted. They were feminine enough to rape, but not feminine enough to be treated with care. Many enslaved women were subject to reproductive research and experiments, thought to be impossible at a time with no anesthesia, simply because it was believed they would feel no pain. Mr. Speaker, African women did not receive sick days, maternity leave, or any courtesy owed to them for being creators of life. These women were bred like livestock and not allowed to care for their children, all while serving as wet nurses and nannies to their enslavers. Women like Flor, Petronille, Koshiba, women whose names were nearly erased from record, but never erased from impact. Women who worked the fields under the whip, who carried children while carrying harvest, who resisted not only through flight and rebellion, but through refusal, through speech, through sheer persistence in the face of systems designed to break them. It is no coincidence that St. Lucia today stands as one of the societies in the region where women are most likely to be leaders in the workplace. That is not accidental progress. It is inherited determination. It is historical memory transformed into action. It is the continuation of what was once survival becoming modern leadership. But let us not romanticize it, because what it is also inherited trauma. In the words of Hilary Beckles, slavery is not an ancient history. Its consequences are still alive with us. A trauma that does not announce itself loudly, but sits in the structures of our societies, in overburdened women, in generational cycles of economic responsibility, in the expectation that strength must always be silent, must always be constant, and must always be carried without complaint. This is the hidden cost of our endurance. When we speak of reparations, we need to also include the undoing of repeated cycles of trauma. When we think of the late Joy St. Omer, God rest her soul, and many of our other sisters in St. Lucia, what we see is a cycle of abuse and neglect towards our women being repeated hundreds of years later. We must aim to not speak in abstract moral terms, but about the repair of our living inheritance. We are speaking about what happens when centuries of extraction meet centuries of silence. So the demand for reparations is not an emotional excess, it is structured justice. And the first step in that justice is an apology. I mean, we have preschoolers all over St. Lucia learning to say I am sorry when they do something wrong. So it is no challenge for nations who have wronged others, the greatest crime against humanity, to come out and say, I am sorry. And while some may try to argue that no wrong was done due to the legality of slavery, it begs the question, why was slavery legal in the Caribbean but not in Europe? Because you knew it was wrong. What we need is not a carefully worded statement designed to ease diplomatic discomfort, but a full, unequivocal acknowledgement of responsibility for the trafficking of enslaved Africans and the system that racialized chattel slavery that followed. An apology is not weakness. It is the minimum requirement for any serious conversation about repair. But, as our children in St. Lucia often say, sorry cannot cure. Our reparatory motion must go further than an apology. Our reparations must aim to amend the damage done to our society and our region at large. The question that follows is simple and unavoidable. What is being repaired? They must strengthen healthcare systems that understand intergenerational trauma in aims to lower health risks that we are more likely to face. Risks of hypertension, of diabetes, and when we look at the Americas, risks of maternal mortality. They must fund educational systems that tell the truth without distortion, and possibly provide opportunities for the young people like us to study abroad. They must empower economies that are not solely dependent on their tourism, rather than implementing visa mandates to keep out their victims. They must invest in climate resilience and coastal protection. They must rebuild cultural archives so that our history is not only written from the perspective of those who governed us, but also from those who survived. They must allow our average St. Lucian a reasonable chance to own land in their own country. And most importantly, they must return agency. Because what was taken was not only labor, it was time, it was land, it was identity, it was our future possibilities. While there are additions that need to be made to the declaration, it is imperative that we have a framework that can be amended at a later date. I am in full agreement with the government's efforts here. In closing, Mr. President, no society can move forward while carrying the unpaid debt of centuries. There is nothing more annoying than when someone owes you money and you have to practically beg them to give it back to you. Records have been kept. Plantation owners and workers have been compensated. Their descendants are still thriving today. When a person faces workplace injustices, they are compensated. So what is the difference here? We are not asking for charity or a handout. We are simply asking for what belongs to us. And in the words of Barbadian artist Rihanna, be better have my money. So, the choice before the international community is not whether reparations are deserved. That question has already been answered by history itself. The real question is whether there is enough courage to act on what is already known. I would like to close with a quote from Desmond Tutu, which states, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Williams.
Mr. President, honorable parliamentarians, distinguished guests, viewers here in person and those joining online, good morning. Before I begin my contribution to this debate, I would first like to take a moment to acknowledge two tragic losses within our nation. Firstly, I would like to honor the life of Joyce and Omer, whose life was taken away through a horrific act of domestic violence. She was a beautiful young lady, full of life, intelligence, and promise, with her entire future ahead of her. I extend my deepest condolences to her family, her friends, and especially to the beautiful daughter she leaves behind. I would also like to extend condolences to the family and friends of Darian Roberts, an extraordinary sportsman who contributed so much through athletics and youth involvement and whose life was also brutally taken away. Mr. President, these tragedies remind us that there is justice in all forms that matter. Whether we are speaking about violence in our homes, violence in our communities, our historical violence against entire peoples, justice can never be ignored. Today, I strongly support this bill on reparatory justice. Not partial support, not hesitant support, but complete and unwavering support. Mr. President, before I proceed, I wish to state that I am not here to hide behind complex language or polished vocabulary meant to impress the ear, but to empty the meaning. I am here to speak plainly, honestly, and from the heart, so that every spoken word in this house is not only heard but understood. Because when we are dealing with issues of justice, history, and human dignity, the goal is not to sound complicated. It is to make the truth impossible to ignore. Mr. President, this bill is necessary because our ancestors endured centuries of injustice, suffering, humiliation, exploitation, and violence. Reparations are not charity. Reparations are acknowledgement. Reparations are accountability. Reparations are justice. For generations, Black people were taught to hate the very things that make us who we are. Our skin color was mocked, our features criticized, our hair was labeled as unprofessional, wild, and less than. Mr. President, although slavery may have been abolished, the mentality still lingers within our societies today. I remember just a few years before I left secondary school, there was an attempt to implement rules that disproportionately targeted Black girls with thick, coily hair textures. So many restrictions, so many rules, but why? Is our natural hair something to be ashamed of? Should we not be proud to exist unapologetically as ourselves? Students with locks were made to feel unwelcomed. Some were forced to cover their hair as though their identity itself was inappropriate. These policies cause outrage among students and parents, and rightfully so. Mr. Speaker, I speak not only from observation, but from personal experience. I once had a teacher recommend that I use bleaching cream to lighten my skin. As a young lady, already struggling with self-esteem, at the time, those words broke me. And if one comment could wound me so deeply, I often ask myself, how did our ancestors survive centuries of being told they were inferior? How did they endure generations of degradation, violence, and dehumanization? Our ancestors were demonized. They were treated as though they were less than human. Yet, these same enslavers had no issues exploiting Black bodies for labor, nor violating Black women through molestation and sexual violence, a violence that often resulted in pregnancies and generational trauma. Our ancestors worked tirelessly under the blazing sun for free labor. They built economies, they built empires, they built wealth they would never benefit from. And despite enduring unimaginable cruelty, they survived. Mr. President, our ancestors were strong. They had to be. And because of that strength, because of that endurance, because of that suffering, they are owed justice. Sometimes I ask myself, how did they withstand such pain? How did they continue to wake up every morning in chains and still find the will to survive? That resilience should never be forgotten, and neither should the debt owed to them. Mr. President, the effects of slavery did not disappear with abolition. They evolved. Even today, in our Caribbean societies, we still witness systems that prioritize outsiders over the descendants of those who built lands with their blood and sweat and suffering. How many of us have gone to our own country by the beach only to be questioned by hotel staff as though we do not belong there? How many times are locals treated as secondary citizens while tourists are given priority? Born and raised in this land, descendants of those who suffered on this land, yet still being made to feel like visitors in our own home. So, kadi moi fête ici a, ek nan viv set lisi whole la vie moi, ek den le moi ay bo beach la, security hotel la ka di moi, se bo beach la se pou Jean Blanc, même Jean Blanc qui te ka bat se ancestors. Mr. President, I say this because this affects not only the historical, Mr. President, I say this because the effects of slavery are not merely historical, they are ongoing. Slavery may have ended legally, but the psychological, social, and economic effects still remain deeply rooted within our institutions, beauty standards, education systems, and even within the minds of our people. That is why reparatory justice matters. Reparations are not about revenge. They are not about hatred, but they are about healing. They are about finally acknowledging generations of pain and ensuring that the future generations do not continue to inherit the wounds of the past without support. No recognition. Mr. President, a society that refuses to confront its history can never truly move forward. And today, I stand proudly in support of this bill because justice delayed must not become justice denied. Mr. President, as I continue my contribution, I believe it is important for us to understand that reparatory justice is not only about financial compensation. It is also about repairing the damage done to generations of people psychologically, socially, culturally, and economically. Because when a people are stripped of their identity, taught to hate themselves, denied opportunities, and forced into cycles of poverty for generations, the effects do not simply disappear overnight. Mr. President, reparatory justice must include education. Our young people deserve to learn about slavery and the oppression our ancestors endured, not watered down versions that minimize the suffering endured by our ancestors. Too often, history books speak about slavery as though it was merely an unfortunate period in history, instead of recognizing it for what it is, one of the greatest crimes against humanity. We must teach our children not only about oppression, but about the resilience and the greatness of our people. Because our ancestors were not weak, they were not helpless, they were survivors, they were innovators, and they were fighters. Mr. President, reparatory justice must also include investment into communities that continue to suffer from the long-term effects of historical injustice. We cannot speak about repairing the past while ignoring poverty, unequal access to education, unfunded schools, lack of mental health support, and limited opportunities that still affect many Black communities today. Justice without action is simply a performance. Hotels are flourishing, business is booming, the tourists are making TikToks about their amazing stay on island, all while our hospitals are understaffed, unequipped with the necessary equipment to serve the people of St. Lucia. How many of us know of someone who has passed away trying to raise funds to get treatment abroad for illnesses we are unable to treat, surgeries we are unable to offer? And if we are truly serious about reparatory justice, then our policies must reflect that seriousness. Mr. President, there are some who may ask, why should we continue discussing slavery? Why can we not simply move on? But I ask in return, how can people move on from wounds that were never properly acknowledged? How can nations heal from the damage that continues to affect generations today? You cannot heal what you refuse to confront. Mr. President, there are still people today battling colorism, still young girls being told that lighter skin is more beautiful, still young boys growing up believing their natural features are not good enough, still workplaces and schools policing Black hair and Black identity. These are not coincidences. These are remnants of a system designed to make Black people feel inferior, and that is exactly why this bill matters. Mr. President, reparatory justice is about restoring dignity. It is about ensuring that future generations of black children grow up loving their skin, embracing their hair, celebrating their culture, and understanding they come from a people who survived the unimaginable. When we speak about reparatory justice, we cannot only speak about the past as though racial injustice ended hundreds of years ago. Because the painful reality is that the suffering of black people did not end with slavery. From the 1600s onwards, millions of Africans were kidnapped from their homes, packed into ships under horrifying conditions, beaten, tortured, sold like property, and forced into slavery across the Caribbean and Americas. Families were separated, children were ripped away from their mothers. Human beings were branded, whipped, starved, and even killed. And for centuries, this cruelty was not only accepted, it was legal. In 1831, during the Baptist War in Jamaica, many enslaved Africans who fought for freedom were brutally executed, and their only crime was demanding liberty. In 1995, Emmett Till, a 14-year-old young black boy, was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered in the United States after being falsely accused of offending a white woman. His killers were acquitted. In 1963, 4 young black girls were killed in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Alabama during the Civil Rights Movement. In 1991, Rodney King was brutally beaten by police officers while the world watched on camera. And even in recent years, we witnessed the horrifying murder of George Floyd in 2020. A black man pinned to the ground, a police officer on his knee kneeling on his neck with his knee for over 9 minutes. A man crying out for his mother. A man crying, "I can't breathe." And yet, there was no regard for his life, no regard for his humanity, no regard for his family watching him die before their own eyes in the world. Mr. President, I ask this House, would a white man have been treated that way? What made that moment even more disturbing was not only the manner of his death, but the fact that his murder was at first attempted to be justified. The world watched as millions of people poured into the streets in the United States and across the globe, demanding justice for a life that should never have been taken in the first place. People stood together, chanting, marching, and refusing to be silent in the face of justice. And yet, we must ask ourselves difficult questions. Why does it seem that in some instances, taking the life of a black man is treated with less urgency, less empathy, and less accountability? Why does it appear that in moments like these, some individuals can act with such disregard for human life and still feel no remorse, still believe their actions can be justified, and still expect to be found not guilty? Mr. President, the uncomfortable truth is that this does not happen in a vacuum. It is the result of conditioning generations of teachings, systems, and narratives that have historically portrayed black people as less human, less deserving of protection, and less worthy of justice. It is the same thinking that once justified slavery, and it is the same thinking that dehumanized our ancestors, and it is the same legacy of belief that still echoes in parts of society today. That is why these events cannot be seen as isolated incidents. These are connected to a long history that we are still trying to correct. And until we can confront that history honestly, we cannot fully address the present. And if such brutality can still happen today, while cameras are rolling and millions are watching, imagine the horrors our ancestors endured during slavery, which, when such treatment was completely legal and socially accepted. Imagine being beaten with no justice. Imagine being tortured with no protection. Imagine being killed while the law stood on the side of the oppressor. Mr. President, this is why reparatory justice is necessary, because the effects of slavery are not buried in the past, they echo through generations. The trauma, the racism, colorism, the economic inequality, and the discrimination. These things did not just disappear, they were built through centuries of oppression. And that is why acknowledging history is not enough. We must actively repair the damage that history created. Because despite everything our ancestors endured, they survived long enough
Senator,
for us to stand here.
You have 5 more minutes.
Thank you. Because despite everything our ancestors endured, they survived long enough for us to stand here today. They are owed more than silence. They are owed more. They are owed recognition, they are owed justice, and they are owed for all the abuse that they have endured. Mr. President, history will judge us not only by what we acknowledge, but also about what we choose to do about it. In closing, today, let's choose courage over comfort, let us choose justice over denial, and let us choose healing over silence. To the members of the opposition, today, you have brought many arguments and many complaints with so much energy, but I haven't heard one suggestion as to what you are planning to do in the bill. To honor our ancestors, it is not only to remember them in words, it is to fight for the dignity they were denied, it is to restore what was stolen, and it is to ensure that this will never happen to our people again. We are not less, and we are worthy. Thank you.
Stains of Glasgow.
Mr. President, I, Opposition Senator Ethan Carlton Glasgow, rise today to unequivocally reject this motion. As stated by my brothers and sisters in the opposition in the lower house and in the upper house, we agree that the governments of the United Kingdom and France do owe a reparatory bill to us for the transatlantic slave trade. However, it is our and my firm belief that this bill is very unlikely to be paid, and as such, we need to address this impracticality along with our foreign and climate policy. Mr. President, it is very unlikely to be paid, as paying would require that the UK and France admitting to the whole world that they are responsible for institutionalized and weaponized racism that for hundreds of years has served to exploit people and natural resources, expropriated our wealth and capital, and undermined our unique cultural identities. We do not stand in opposition of this unavoidable truth. We oppose this belated, poorly thought out plan which is destined to fail. Its core premise is incredibly naive, falsely assuming that populist governments like those in France and the UK that have passed laws specifically to shield their economies and belief systems from collapse will suddenly allow themselves to be hindered in support of our ascendancy. Mr. President, in Dr. Hilary Beckles' seminal work, Britain's Black Debt, Dr. Beckles points out the fact that wealth, power, and dignity were extracted from African peoples in the Caribbean to build UK metropolises like Liverpool and Bristol. As such, Dr. Beckles implies that we, in the Commonwealth Caribbean, are like banks that have been owed for far too long by their debtors. However, Mr. President, just like any good bank, we in the Caribbean need to recognize that this debt is very unlikely to be paid. Both the two major parties in the United Kingdom, the Tories and the Labour, have strongly opposed this idea of paying back what is owed. During the United Nations General Assembly vote on March 25, 2026, both the United Kingdom and France decided to abstain from calling the transatlantic slave trade the gravest crime against humanity, thus showing that they are unwilling to vote on the basic facts of slavery, let alone pay us for the harm they have caused. Of particular importance to this motion is the idea that racism, in particular discrimination of black African individuals by white Europeans, is systemic and perpetuates to this day. The government seems to agree with that fact and yet encourages this idea that somehow Britain and France will magically come to its senses and realize it needs to pay us for crimes against humanity. Even on CARICOM's 10-point plan website, it says, and I quote, "The CARICOM Reparations Commission operates within the context of persistent objection from European governments to its mandate. The only way for reparations to happen is for racism to end." This is extremely unlikely. We cannot hang hopes on the unlikely. We cannot pass laws on the unlikely. Mr. President, this is unfeasible, as even Dr. June Soomer, a member of St. Lucia's National Reparations Commission, said, and I quote, "The racism never ends." Moreover, this is a fact established in the book Britain's Black Debt itself, as Beckles notes that then Prime Minister Tony Blair in 2007 said that blacks should receive no apology and their descendants should receive no compensation. Mr. President, what this means is that we have to write off Britain's black debt. We, the St. Lucian people, cannot rely on the British or French government for our developmental needs. If we do, we may as well become a colony again. We need to look outward to develop. Additionally, the Illegal Migration Act of the United Kingdom of 2023 emphasizes this point, as it allows the government to unilaterally, the British government, to unilaterally reject asylum seekers, thus ignoring the proud tradition of the UK to welcome political asylum seekers outside of their own country, like those from the Caribbean. This shows that the British government is clearly unwilling to take a loan to repay what was stolen, as they are actively changing their own laws to sanctify evil. In addition, even rising opposition parties like Reform UK have outright stated that if Caribbean islands like ours continue asking for reparations, we could end up being barred from entering the UK. On May 7, 2026, British Council elections, the Reform Party made massive wins, winning the largest number of seats, suggesting that British people support anti-reparations rhetoric. Mr. President, this is clearly a country that has no intention of owning up to its past. They have decided to file for moral bankruptcy. We need to accept that bankruptcy and move on. Mr. President, moral high ground hasn't even compelled us to treat our own CARICOM neighbor Haiti with basic dignity by allowing them to enter St. Lucia without a visa. A fact I know the government is acutely aware of, as the member for Castries North is originally from Haiti. We in the opposition have specific concerns with the wording of this motion. Point 9 says to, and I quote, "encourage St. Lucian foreign policy to align with regional and international efforts for reparatory justice." A motion requires precision. Mr. President, it is impossible for us in the opposition to support an astoundingly vague concept. The word encourage is too vague. It could mean anything from a pat on the back to a chicken and rice meal at our next meeting, to something more substantive. And that lack of precision is precisely why this motion cannot be seriously considered or implemented. Additionally, in this motion, they have not said where the funds will be managed and located and what measures will be deployed to protect them from the common governance failures we see today. Mr. President, as has been noted many times before by my brothers and sisters in the opposition, there is clause 4 in this motion, which speaks to the development of legislation in order to manage the reparations transparently. We need to determine whether the reparation funds will be kept entirely separate from existing sovereign wealth funds. We must establish whether these funds will be held by a local bank or a foreign financial institution. We need to clarify if the funds will be routed through the United States as per established financial norms, and whether the United States will claim a percentage of the transfer. However, relying on future legislation is a form of avoidance diplomacy in this Parliament. It is not plausible to blame the current problems with crimes committed in the past while ignoring what we can fix right now. We have had a blueprint for the way forward since the Moyne Commission of the 1930s, but are only recently achieving some basic recommendations like minimum wage legislation. We must determine whether we are really taking responsibility for our own destinies or if this motion effectively outsources the consequences of poor governance to Europe. In the motion, the preamble correctly states, and I quote, that the European Industrial Revolution has been linked as a driving force behind the present climate and environmental crises. In fact, France pledged 600 billion United States dollars between 2020 and 2025 to the whole world in reparations because of this. Despite this, the climate environmental group Notre Affaire à Tout, which translates to Our Common Cause, has stated that France does not use all the tools at its disposal to tackle the climate problem, contrary to what they said. In other words, they are not actually paying up. In fact, according to Oxfam France, approximately 92% of France's bilateral climate finance was in the form of loans at standard interest rates. This means that even though France says it's going to pay for the damages caused by climate change, it has been clear through their actions that it's very unlikely. Furthermore, with the ICJ ruling in 2025 saying that bigger countries have to pay smaller countries like ours for climate reparations, the United Kingdom's Shadow Foreign Secretary said, and I quote, "Activist-led court rulings like this should never be treated as binding," illustrating the United Kingdom's own intention to not pay. Thus, France and the UK have continued to show their unwillingness to be accountable in practice, to be bound by the agenda of reparations for their actions. The member from Castries Central yesterday spoke about climate vulnerability and how St. Lucia is uniquely placed to be hurt more by hurricanes and natural disasters. I will take a look at our own climate policy directly. Mr. President, our national energy policy for 2023 to 2030 speaks about a transition from fossil fuels to a substantially decarbonized economy, not an energy-efficient economy. On page 26 of St. Lucia's nationally determined contribution communicated to the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, we only promised the United Nations a 46% renewable energy penetration target by 2035. Currently, St. Lucia's energy is largely reliant on the burning of fossil fuels, which is currently the primary source of climate change across the globe. According to the International Renewable Energy Agency, as of 2022, 92% of St. Lucia's total energy supply comes from the burning of fossil fuels. We cannot start asking for reparations for a climate change problem that we are partially inflicting on ourselves. The New International Version of the Bible says it best in Romans chapter 2 verses 1, which says, and I quote, "You, therefore, have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else, for at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things. Mr. President, this is also stated in St. Lucia's Sectoral Adaptation Strategy and Action Plan for the water sector for 2018 to 2028, better known as Water SASAP, where on page 19 it says that our country has been inactive in addressing our vulnerability to climate change. It conservatively predicts that by 2050, 24.5% of our gross domestic product would be spent on climate inaction. In addition, we need to take a look at our own local development. According to the Caribbean Development Bank, the biggest industrial project of last year and this year, the Millennium Highway and West Coast Road Reconstruction Project, 57% of that money was invested through the United Kingdom, through UK aid. This illustrates an attitude of poor economic policy being categorized by help from larger foreign powers. Mr. President, I'd also like to address the member for Dennery North's assertion comparing reparations to independence, which presents a perilous misrepresentation of history. Our independence was not a bestowal from England, but rather a calculated disengagement. The UK was burdened by the immense debt of the Second World War. Britain, in a move of strategic abandonment, distanced itself of its colonial responsibilities, perceiving Caribbean colonies as fiscal encumbrances rather than the integral parts of an enduring commonwealth. Dare I remind this chamber that the wealth of Britain has also never been common.
Senator Glasgow, you have 5 more minutes to complete your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. President. This sovereignty, far from being a hard-won triumph, was a deliberate transfer of the black debt we speak about, substituting structural accountability with the precarious offer of conditions. We did not win our freedom. We were presented with the ledger for centuries of exploitation and left to be centered with the resultant impoverishment. Allow me, Mr. President, to sum up the arguments me and my colleagues have made for the past 2 days. 1, we cannot continue with this attitude of poor governance, which is characterized by the lack of current foreign policy innovation away from the Eurocentric goal of handouts in official development assistance. As stated by the member for Viewfort North, it is further evident in that we have very unprogressive ties with the global south. The member for Soufrière stated that we still define ourselves culturally, monetarily, and politically and inextricably linked to our former slave masters. They have defined our governance models, electoral systems, and values. Thankfully, we have the Caribbean Court of Justice, but we still call the United Kingdom's monarch our head of state. We first need to mentally emancipate ourselves from slavery, and this motion lacks the capacity to move in that direction, as it is myopic, simplistic in outlook, and scarce in detail. The Honorable Gamar Gums, Minister for Nevis II, in the St. Kitts and Nevis Youth Parliament said it best when he said, and I quote, "Reparatory justice is too important for sloppy resolutions." Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Hyacinth.
Good morning. Right. Good afternoon, Mr. President, my fellow members of the government, opposition, and the independents. Mr. President, I rise today in support of this resolution with a profound sense of duty, not only to our generation, but also to those who came before us and those yet to come. Mr. President, thus far we've all argued that reparations is necessary. It is owed to us, no matter what. But Mr. President, I am disappointed in the opposition. They have consistently said that Britain and France will not pay us. Yet not one of them have provided a suitable alternative. Mr. Glasgow just stood up and told us that we should effectively, is my mic on? Mr. Glasgow stood up and effectively told us that we should give up if they say no and focus on other developmental opportunities. And I say no. No, we should not give up. It is owed to us for all the work that we have done over the years. Mr. President, it took 313 years to have our people emancipated, from the very first slave revolt up until the last. Mr. President, they owe us, it is their obligation, yet they have consistently made the decision that they will.
Mr. President.
Take a seat, Senator. Sit.
Mr. President, I rise on a point of order to Mr. Hyacinth. Let me correct. First, he addressed this motion as a resolution, Mr. President. This is not a resolution. Resolutions refer to things that have already been passed. This is a motion. It is still going through the upper house. So I'd like the member to to correct himself and call it a motion.
Are you saying on a point of order or point of elucidation?
Point of order for misleading the House.
Okay, thank you, Senator. Honorable Senator?
Yes.
The opposition senator is indicating that you referred to the bill as a resolution, whereas a resolution has already been passed. So in further speaking, please refer to it as a motion. You may proceed.
All right, Mr. President. I will come back to that point of semantics which the opposition has been very steady on for the past 2 days. But as he said, it is a motion, and I believe that the opposition has forgotten that themselves, because they are acting like this is a finished product, that we resolve this today and that tomorrow we receive our reparations, and that is not what we are asking for. We are starting the process. We're bringing this forward to a legislative and diplomatic state, right, where we can find a way to do this, because we have been trying to do this for a very long time, for decades, and we have not made that much significant progress. Now then, I will do what the opposition has failed to do. I will try to work with us all so that we can find a solution. If they tell us no, what will we do? If they tell us yes, how will we manage that? And the body and the motion, which was so massively crafted, it states exactly what we plan to do. One, our guiding framework. We're not blindly following CARICOM, like the leader of the opposition said yesterday. We are utilizing CARICOM's framework to guide our national policy. This is not just the CARICOM's thing with St. Lucia's mask on it. No, we are here as a people, as a government, to show our people that we care and we do have knowledge of what happened in the past. Now, my apologies for that. Sorry. Secondly, the motion states clearly that we will give more power to the National Reparations Committee, in essence. The National Reparations Committee, established in 2013, currently, as Mr. Daniel stated, doesn't have that much power in implementation. By giving that power to the individuals who are professionals, like the woman who spoke with us, by giving that authority to those who have that knowledge and can advocate on our behalf and can make the decisions and the...
Hold on, Senator.
Yes.
Yes.
On a point of order, Mr. President, the senator is misleading the House. I did not indicate that the NRC began in 2015. That is not what I said. I would like that to retract that statement. Thank you.
Okay, Honorable Senator. But before I ask him to retract, would you mind elucidating the House as to what you said?
Mr. President, I indicated the year, which was 2014 and not 2015. So I would like that you retract that statement, as I did not say 2015. Thank you.
Honorable Senator.
Okay. I would like to correct him. I didn't make a mistake. I said 2013, not 2015. So I apologize.
Okay, Mr. Okay.
But, Mr. President, throughout history, the entire Caribbean and the African diaspora has been trampled by European powers. We've seen this trampling and this system that extend far longer than slavery through two main pillars. The first being the erasure of our identity as descendants of the motherland Africa, and the consistent economic dependency that we have been forced into, that we have been subjugated into by Europe, by specifically England and France. I'd like to start off by talking about our identity as descendants of the motherland. After England and France and the other European powers ransacked the Caribbean for its resources and committed countless atrocities against the indigenous people, which the CARICOM 10-point plan also discusses, they looked to the west coast of Africa for laborers in order to continue lining their pockets with money and gold. It took us from our homes and fueled internal conflicts along the coast to ensure constant supply of slaves. And once we were in the New World, they separated us. They even developed internal classism amongst us. Like my member said, a teacher once recommended that she bleach the skin. We as black people, because of that racism that was forced upon us, racism was created by those colonials to keep us separated and never allow us to ascend in our movements. She was told to bleach her skin because us as black people sometimes believe that the darker you are, the uglier you are. And that is an ugly mindset. Only ugly people have that mindset. Mr. President, during slavery, they stripped us of our humanity with their laws, and one of the greatest insults towards us as black people is that the Code Noir and the Barbados slave codes have not yet been repealed from the law books. Mr. President, another great injustice committed against us was the singularization of Africa, as though it is one nation, one people, one land. It is a continent filled with a myriad of diverse ethnic groups and several civilizations. Mr. President, this singularization does not exist in any other continent on earth. We do not say that the entirety of Europe was engaged in wars and whatnot, or that they were complicit in the Holocaust and in the actions of World War II. We do not say that. We say that we acknowledge their unity, we acknowledge the diversity. Mr. President, this agenda of singularization that has been pushed in our media and our education for decades has led to the creation of the senseless argument that the descendants of the slaves, that even some descendants of slaves believe that Africa was complicit in the slave trade. And I would like to honestly commend the opposition for not making that stupid argument. Mr. President, Mr. President, Africans were not totally complicit in the slave trade. That argument is made as though non-compliance. That argument was made as though there were no consequences to non-compliance. I'd like to bring forward an example of the Kingdom of Ndongo, situated in modern-day Angola, which was completely destroyed during Portuguese slave raids because they did not comply with their offers. Mr. President, that compliance with slavery and that compliance with the European powers and the consequences of that non-compliance can be clearly shown in what happened in Haiti. Haiti was the first truly large-scale successful slave revolution. Haiti had to pay for that. Their leader, Toussaint Louverture, was coerced into coming to France, and then they put him back in chains. They put him back in a cage as though to tell him that you are a slave and you are nothing more, and you will die as that. He died in a cage in France. Their people were forced to pay pay reparations for their own freedom for centuries. Because of that economic, apologies, sorry, because of what was placed upon them by the French government, they suffered centuries of political unrest, and currently, look at the state of Haiti. Damn near the entire nation is impoverished. Deforestation has taken a root in the, deforestation has taken over their lands, and the people are indeed suffering. Mr. President, I must now look at the next pillar, which I believe is the even more important pillar, that pillar of economic dependency. During slavery, Caribbean islands were only allowed to trade with their mainlands. This practice, in essence, continued long after emancipation because the mainlands then decided that they would give us preferential treatment to allow for cheap purchase of our goods on the global stage. This system maintained until Britain and France, or Britain in particular, for St. Lucia's case, decided it was no longer profitable towards them. Our exports to England went from cane to charcoal to the green gold bananas. And throughout all of that, our agency as a nation was never granted to us. We were still subservient to Britain and their economic demands. Mr. President, what could have freed us from that dependency was industrialization. But Britain and France outright stated that they would not allow it. They would not allow for us as a nation to build our own industrial wealth. They would not allow us to develop our own capital so that we could say that we would do it on our own. Mr. President, we can see what could have happened to us. Look at Singapore. Whilst we do have certain other constraints, that being our topography, Singapore was able to develop itself from a similar state of poverty as us to grow and flourish as a nation. Mr. President, because of our limited resources and what our greatest resources are, being our land and our people, we were pretty much steered into the realm of tourism as our only option for economic growth. And that system of tourism has created what I believe is a modern-day plantation economy. You can see it clearly. The people are forced into the same systems as old. They work long hours and receive a residual amount of the total economic benefit of the entire hotel industry. Mr. President, there are so few hotels in St. Lucia that are owned by St. Lucians and benefit the St. Lucians directly. A majority of that wealth is extracted from us and is taken abroad. Look at the Marriott brand, the Sandals brand, the Hyatt brand, all these brands who own a majority of the hotels in St. Lucia. How does that really benefit us apart from they employ our people for pennies? They bring in tourists for us, yes, who come and they walk in and they who come in and they spend in our local markets, but a majority where that real money comes from in the stay, the accommodations and all these different aspects, we don't have any access to that. Mr. President, that economic dependency extends far beyond trade and commerce. It has shaped our environmental vulnerability and weakened our climate resilience. Mr. President, the colonial plantations like in Roseau were often established along rivers and vulnerable coastal regions for economic convenience, with little regard for long-term environmental sustainability. Moreover, for generations, Caribbean students received little formal education about the environmental realities of their own region. Combined with the settlement patterns of those who squatted on crown lands because they lacked the availability of land. Let's take, for example, a recent tragedy in Corinth in November 2022. The Corinth, at the base there, that is a flood basin. Water naturally settles in that area, and persons were forced into that area because they could not find land, affordable land, to live elsewhere, so they squatted. And now almost 100 homes were devastated and were damaged. $1.8 million in damages was occurred from that devastating flood. I'm sure we all saw the videos of people's belongings, fridges, dishwashers, everything floating in the Corinth area. Mr. President, those disasters are increasingly intensified by climate change, driven largely by centuries of industrial emissions from major powers. We small island states contribute a less than insignificant amount to climate change, yet we suffer its consequences ferociously, while those who contribute the most are insulated from its effects. Whenever a hurricane strikes, it leaves lasting impact on our people and our industries. Hurricane Allen in 1980 destroyed 90% of our banana crops. Hurricane Thomas in 2010 cost us $336 million in damages. The Christmas Eve trough in 2015 cost us $267.76 million in damages and left over 500 people displaced with home. That is just economic values. We're not even talking about the most valuable thing there that we lost, human life, Mr. President. So many people died from these things, and these disasters were exacerbated by the colonials and their expansion, their industrial activities, with no care for what happens to us small island states. Mr. President, the cycle is clear as day, and the reparations movement seeks to break that cycle and give St. Lucia the equity it requires to build itself out of the current state that we are in, build ourselves up on our own demands and not on their terms. Mr. President, this resolution has identified 90
Senator,
points. Yes?
You have 5 more minutes to conclude your presentation.
Okay, noted. Into 4 core themes. That is the demand for reparations from both Britain and France, the establishment of national structures and legislations to responsibly manage reparatory movement and investment in the youth, education and climate resilience, and unity with CARICOM and international allies in the fight for reparations. Now, Mr. President, at the beginning, I made 2 promises. Allow me to keep my promise. Mr. President, Mr. Glasgow is, in all honesty, correct in his assertion that Britain and France have consistently made it obviously clear that they will not pay us. But in that same way, 500 years ago, Britain and France and Spain and the United States of America made it abundantly clear that they will not free us. We banded together. We kept on that movement until eventually they did. And that is the only way, by holding out hope. That is the only way that we can get to that point there. Right? By banding together as a uniform group. If the African Union, the CARICOM, OECS, and all these regional organizations come together and apply pressure and show that we will not stand for you denying us our rights.
Honorable Senator Hulana. Yes, Madam Senator.
Mr. President, I would like to move the motion that Standing Order 32.8 be suspended to allow Senator Hyacinth an extra 5 minutes to speak.
Senators, the question before us is that we allow the Senator an extra 5 minutes to speak. Senator, proceed. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, the St. Lucian experience with colonial history is quite unique and deeply complex. Although our island was a stronghold for resistance, even in Kalinago days, our island changed hands between Britain and France 14 times. Under both colonial administrations, enslaved Africans endured the same exploitation, displacement, and dehumanization. Under both administrations, wealth was extracted from this island in the names of the empires and for their benefit, while we suffered for generations. And so this resolution is correct in urging the government of St. Lucia to explore avenues for reparations from both Britain and France. And that exploration of avenues must be spearheaded by the National Reparations Committee. By doing so, giving them the power to make decisions and to advocate on our behalf and to go about and to band and to unite. These individuals are professionals. They know the work. They live in the reparations movement, and they are the best persons that can give us the answers that we need. Mr. President, on that note, I would like to take a moment to applaud the French president. Despite Britain and France consistently saying that they will not pay us, the French president, even though it may just be words alone, it may just be semantics, has at least started the process by trying to open the discussion on reparations. On that same note, I wish to say to all of us as St. Lucians, and all of us black people universally, that we should condemn the British government for their consistent anti-reparations and anti-reparations foreign policy, especially considering the immense part to play in the horrors of slavery and countless irreparable atrocities they committed in search of wealth across the globe. Mr. President, to better my apologies. Mr. President, I also commend the resolution's emphasis on youth engagement. We the youth inherit the burdens of the past along with the responsibilities of the future. We must therefore be included in advocacy, policy discussions, and decision-making processes relating to reparatory justice. And as such, I would like to commend the government of St. Lucia and the Ministry of Youth and Sports for organizing this debate to open the national discourse on reparations and involving the youth in the discussion. Finally, Mr. President, I support this call for St. Lucia's foreign policy to further align with regional and international efforts advocating for reparatory justice. St. Lucia should stand along CARICOM and other international partners in advancing these discussions on the global stage. As the saying goes, united we stand, but divided we fall. We must demonstrate a united front in this we must demonstrate a united front in this movement if we truly wish to see it succeed. Mr. President, the Caribbean did not arrive at dependency naturally. It was engineered through slavery, colonialism, and extraction for generations of deliberate underdevelopment. Reparations, therefore, are not acts of generosity. They are obligations owed to us. We are no longer merely descendants of the enslaved. We are descendants of survivors, builders, and nations that have endured every attempt at erasure placed before us. And if the wealth of the empires was built from Caribbean suffering, then justice demands that the Caribbean people participate fully in the future their ancestors helped finance. I therefore stand firmly in support of this resolution. Thank you, Mr. President. Motion.
Senator Daisy.
Mr. President, honorable senators, parliamentarians, distinguished guests, good day. I rise today as Senator Amanda Daisy in unwavering support of this motion on reparations. And let me begin by making one thing absolutely clear. Reparations are not about revenge. They are about justice. Because every single time this conversation is raised, there are people who suddenly become uncomfortable. People who act as though reparations are unreasonable, unrealistic, unnecessary, or somehow too far. But Mr. President, what is truly unacceptable is expecting people to endure centuries of brutality, exploitation, dehumanization, and oppression while the world continues to profit from that suffering, and then demanding that we remain silent about it. This is what is unacceptable. Mr. President, slavery was not simply an unfortunate chapter in history. It was one of the greatest crimes against humanity the world has ever seen. For over 300 years, millions of African men, women, and children were ripped from their homes, separated from their families, stripped of their names, stripped of their dignity, chained like property and forced into generations of brutal labor because their suffering generated wealth. Their blood built economies, their labor built empires, their pain financed industries, their exploitation created global power and privilege that still exists today. And even after slavery officially ended, accountability still never arrived. Because let us remember something many people conveniently ignore. The enslavers were compensated, the enslaved were not. The people who committed the cruelty received financial compensation for their loss of property, while the people who suffered generations of torture, violence, rape, and forced labor received absolutely nothing. No land, no wealth, no economic support, no repair, no recognition. Imagine surviving centuries of brutality only to be abandoned the moment freedom arrives. And today, people have the audacity to ask why reparations matter. Mr. President, let us stop pretending that slavery ended and everything magically became equal, because it did not. The chains may have been removed, but the systems remained. The inequality remained. The poverty remained. The economic dependency remained. The racial injustice remained. The Caribbean was exploited for centuries, and many of our nations are still fighting to recover from systems designed to keep us dependent, vulnerable, and underdeveloped. And that is exactly why reparations matter. Because when harm is done on that scale, repairs becomes a moral obligation. This is not radical, that is common sense. If someone destroys a home, they are expected to repay it. If someone causes damage, accountability follows. If someone commits a crime, consequences follow. So why is slavery the one crime where accountability suddenly becomes controversial? Why is responsibility only rejected when black nations demand justice? And let me address the opposition directly. Slavery, some may say slavery happened a long time ago, but honorable senators, the effects did not stay in the past. We are living with them right now. Generational poverty did not appear from nowhere. Mass inequality did not appear from nowhere. The absence of inherited wealth in many black communities did not appear from nowhere. These are consequences of history. And history does not stop affecting people simply because time has passed. Because if wealth created through slavery can be inherited, then the consequences of slavery can also be inherited. You cannot inherit privilege and then pretend nobody inherited suffering. The argument collapses immediately. And let us be honest in this chamber today. Many nations became wealthy through the extraction of resources, labor, and wealth from other territories for centuries, while Caribbean societies were left economically vulnerable and structurally disadvantaged. So when Caribbean people ask for reparatory justice, we are not asking for a charity, we are asking for accountability. There is a difference. Mr. President, honorable senators, this debate is far bigger than money, because of opposition members love to reduce the reparations to just handing out checks as though the issue is that simple. But reparations are about repair. They are about restoring dignity. They are about correcting injustice. They are about creating opportunities that were systematically denied for generations. And that is why CARICOM introduced a 10-point plan for reparatory justice. A plan focused on education, healthcare, cultural restoration, psychological rehabilitation, economic development, debt cancellation, and repaying the long-term damage by slavery and its legacy. This is not a charity. That is responsibility. And honestly, I find it interesting how quickly the world understands compensation in every other circumstance. When countries suffer after war, reconstruction follows. When communities are harmed, settlements are negotiated. When businesses commit wrongdoing, victims are compensated. But the moment Black Caribbean nations demand accountability for centuries of exploitation, people suddenly say, forget the past. Move on, that was a long time ago. Move on. How do you move on from stolen generations? How do you move on when your ancestors built wealth they themselves were never allowed to benefit from? You cannot preach healing whilst refusing accountability. That is hypocrisy. And let us speak today, honestly. Many people are comfortable celebrating the wealth, infrastructure, and development created through that system of exploitation. Because they become uncomfortable acknowledging the suffering that it created. They enjoy the benefits of history whilst rejecting responsibility for its consequences. Again, that is hypocrisy. Because you cannot separate the suffering that it produced. Mr. President, the United Nations declares slavery a crime against humanity. A crime against humanity. And crime against humanity demands accountability. So why is this the one crime where descendants of victims are expected to simply get over it? Why are descendants of enslaved people expected to carry generational pain in silence just to protect the convenience of others? Because at the end of the day, opposition to reparation is not truly about fairness, it is about comfort. Comfort for those who do not want the difficult conversations. Comfort for those who benefit from the inequalities history created. Comfort for those who would rather silence the discussion than confront the truth. But leadership is not about protecting comfort. Leadership is about confronting truth even when that truth is uncomfortable. And the truth is the Caribbean helped build modern worlds through forced labor, exploitation, and suffering. Our ancestors gave their lives to economies they themselves would never benefit from. And today we are not begging for sympathy, we are demanding dignity, we are demanding acknowledgement, demanding justice, because justice delayed is still justice denied. Mr. President, what message do we send as young leaders if we acknowledge centuries of injustice but refuse to support repair? What message do we send to the future generation? That exploitation becomes acceptable once enough time has passed? That crime against black people deserves sympathy but no action? That history can only be remembered when it is convenient? I refuse to support that message. I refuse to water down history to protect feelings. And I refuse to stand silently while people attempt to paint reparations as unreasonable. Because what is truly unjust is centuries of exploitation without accountability. What is truly unacceptable is profiting from suffering while denying repair. Mr. President, this is not about division. This is about justice. It is about finally recognizing that the suffering of our ancestors mattered. It is about ensuring that history is not acknowledged through empty speeches and symbolic gestures alone, but meaningful action. Because acknowledgement without action is performative, and repair without accountability is incomplete. Today, St. Lucia has a choice. We can stand on the side of courage, truth, and justice, or we can stand on the side of denial, discomfort, and silence. As for me, my position is clear. I stand proudly, firmly, and unapologetically in support of reparations. Not because it is politically convenient, not because it is easy, not because it is popular, but it's because it is morally right. And history will always remember those who had the courage to stand up for justice when it mattered most. I thank you.
Senator, Leader of Government Business.
Mr. President, I am truly disappointed with the opposition and what they had to say towards this motion. Negative people will always have a problem towards every situation, but never a solution. The opposition has posed many weak arguments. The opposition is literally fighting against us instead of fighting against the enemy. And there is a theory where you place red and black ants in a jar and you shake the jar, and you know what happens? The red ants and the black ants begin to fight each other. This is us fighting each other right now, instead of us directly going towards the enemy, which is the whole point of reparatory justice. Mr. President, we have offered multiple solutions: debt relief, healthcare, education, and so forth, to name a few. The arguments, even when I presented, the argument from the independent senator, well, the opposition senator, sorry, she said things I've never said. And I'm starting to wonder, is she quoting from today or from yesterday or when exactly? Is the opposition rebutting
Leader
for
government
rebutting's
business.
sake? Yes.
Yes, Honorable Senator.
I'm standing on a point of order because the Honorable Senator is misleading the House.
How is she misleading the House?
The government refers to the upper and lower house. Never in my speech did I specify that when I said government, I was referring to only the upper house. So I would really like if the Honorable Senator would retract her statement, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, Honorable Senator, Leader of Opposition Business is saying that when she mentioned government, she didn't specify whether it's upper or lower house.
Mr. President, I am not retracting my statement. I said I am not sure when exactly, if it was from today or from yesterday or whenever, but she put it from
Honorable Senator, the Honorable Leader of Government Business indicated she didn't state whether it was a specific date. She said she don't know if it was today or yesterday. Yes, Honorable Senator.
Mr. President, hence the reason why, to the point of order, I was clarifying for her.
So you're standing on a point of elucidation.
My apologies. Point of elucidation, I was clarifying that I never specified if it was upper house or lower house. So she's still misleading the House in that regard.
Okay, thank you, Senator. Senator, she just elucidated you that she didn't specify.
Mr.
Please continue.
I never asked for elucidation. I'm just saying. Mr. President, I'm wondering, is the opposition rebutting for rebutting's sake? And are they just disagreeing for whatever speech they have on paper? Or are they actually making a point? They're also asking, why hasn't the history expansion already started? Mr. President, Rome was not built in one day. And if this really is the opposition's point, why couldn't they have been the first to suggest it before this motion? Mr. President, the opposition is bent on separating themselves from us instead of making a valuable point. The senator also said that the motion has passive language. Are you suggesting we be hostile and create the same war we are currently fighting against? Does hostility mean seriousness or that things will get done? We are in a situation we are in because of slavery. We do not have the leverage
Senator?
to be hostile.
Yes, Senator Glasgow.
Mr. President, the member is misleading the House. She said that why she talked about passive language, and what we're saying is that, for example, in my case, when we looked at the word "to encourage," they said to encourage St. Lucia's foreign policy to align with international efforts for reparations. What we are asking for is clarification on what those words actually mean. That is what we mean by passive language, Mr. President.
But Honorable Senator, you did use the word passive language. Please take your seat, sir.
Mr. President, I have to really question if the opposition is paying attention or are they just reading what they wrote this morning. Anyway, as I was saying, we do not have the leverage to be hostile. That does not mean we're begging. We already at a disadvantage. It is one thing to seek clarity, but another thing to choose to not understand. Again, is the opposition opposing for opposition's sake? Mr. President, this is a motion, as the colleague said. We have to agree with the concept before applying a rigid framework. Instead of saying clauses are unclear, why not at least see it as a roadmap regardless of focusing on every missing detail? Earlier on, Senator Regis, Independent Senator Regis, gave us information and you questioned her source. But Mr. President, the independent senators have been given a whole heap of statistics and you haven't not once questioned their source, which I think is unfair.
Honorable Senator, they quoted the sources. He quoted the UN, he quoted some other French book. She quoted CXC. Please retract that statement.
Okay. Mr. President, as earlier on, a senator asked what our contingency
Honorable
plan.
Senator, please retract the statement that I didn't do it. I actually listened and they provide their source.
Okay, Mr. President, statement retract.
Thank you, Senator. You may continue.
Mr. President, earlier on, a senator asked what our contingency plan is if Britain and France continues to say no. We never said we are dependent on Britain and France. This is not the basis of our argument. We are seeking justice. They're simply not asking for perfection. They're asking for a plan. Mr. President, I have to ask again, was the opposition even paying attention to what we were saying? Or are they just reading the speeches? We're not saying reparation is going to save us. We want acknowledgement, accountability, and repair. Mr. President, I had another piece to add, but it's going to stir the pot. Mr. President, and I need to choose my words very carefully. It's interesting how one of our senators mentioned, you know, they were so much against reparation, justice, and so forth. But did you know that there were several owned plantations in the St. Vincent and Grenadines by Sir Robert Glasgow? They were heavily, and I'm not pointing fingers. I'm not pointing fingers. This is just an example. They were heavily involved in plantation slavery for the British Caribbean. Need I not say more? I thank you.
Senator Glasgow.
Mr. President, I would like to stand on a point of elucidation. What is the relevance of the name of a former slave owner? I would like to know.
Honorable Senator, it is relevant because yesterday we listed names of people who were affected directly. So now she is simply naming
No. Mr.
Honorable Senator, please allow me to make a ruling. Yesterday we listed people who were affected directly.
Exactly.
Today she listed the person who did it.
Exactly. Because
I understand the fact that the Honorable Senator, that is his surname. I get that.
I was not aware.
Yes, Honorable Senator.
Mr. President, can I just add that this was not a direct attack on anyone, because earlier on in my speech I mentioned the Bokash estate, the Kako estate, and so forth. There were many plantation owners. I did some research and that happened to have been one of the plantation owners. It was not a direct attack.
Okay, thank you, Honorable Senator.
But my apologies if you feel attacked. Genuinely. I didn't attack you.
Honorable Senators, the question is that Youth Parliament Senate 1. Calls for the full and unreserved implementation of the CARICOM 10-point plan for reparatory justice. 2. Urges the government of St. Lucia to explore avenues of reparations from both the British, French, relating to the enduring socio-economic and environmental impacts of slavery and colonialism, including climate vulnerability. 3. Recommends the established National Reparations Committee coordinate all research, policy, and advocacy efforts on behalf of the government of St. Lucia. 4. Supports the development of legislation to govern the transparent management of any reparation resources. 5. Calls for the comprehensive education reform to include African and Caribbean history, cultural identity, and reparation awareness within the school's curricula. 6. Encourages national public education campaigns to raise awareness about the legacy of enslavement and its modern-day impacts. 7. Promotes youth engagement and leadership in reparations, advocacy, and decision-making process. 8. Supports the creation of funding mechanisms to invest in community development, education, and youth empowerment initiatives. 9. Encourages St. Lucia's foreign policy to align with the regional and international efforts advocating for reparatory justice. And be it further resolved that the reparatory justice is a moral, legal, and historical obligation owed to the people of St. Lucia and the wider Caribbean. I now put the question. As many who have that opinion, say aye.
Aye.
As many who have the contrary opinion, say no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. I also would like to thank the Repair Campaign, the Department of Youth and Sports, and the NYC for putting this together. Dr. Junes Sumar, Fiona Compton, and Earl Busquet for the help in training and history research. Leader of Government Business.
Mr. President, I move that the House stand adjourned sine die.
Honorable Senators, the question is that this House do stand adjourned sine die. I now put the question. As many who are of that opinion say aye. Aye. As many who have a contrary opinion say no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Sitting adjourned.
All right.
No, because I didn't directly attack.
Wow.
Good afternoon, yes. Good afternoon, online viewers. And thank you for viewing day 2 of St. Lucia National Youth Parliament. And our senators represented well. Don't you think so, Mr.
It was very interesting. I'm not going to lie. This is one of the most interesting Senate sittings I have ever seen since I've entered youth parliament back in 2017. We want to thank all of you for tuning in for the second day and the final day of youth parliament 2026. It was very liberating. They were so professional. They were so articulate. They were so determined. They just did so well, and I couldn't be prouder of this moment. I didn't have a favorite moment. I think all moments were favorite moments. But we want to look at our youth and say, call into the Ministry of Youth and Sports to find out when the next youth parliamentary sitting is. If you could interesting, contact the youth workers, contact the St. Lucia National Youth Council. We want to thank our partners who made this possible. We want to thank all the ministers, Minister Kenton Casimir, the Honorable Kenton Casimir for Representative of Brozile and Ministry of Youth and Sports. We want to thank Sean Edward, Minister for Infrastructure, for showing up. We want to thank all our parliamentary representatives who showed up and supported our young people. And we also want to thank you, the viewers, and those in the diaspora for tuning in and making sure as well. Thank you so much for also sharing as well. And we want to speak to the families of those who have passed. We stand with you. St. Lucia, stay safe, stay secured, and keep pushing our young people forward. Have a good afternoon.
Still continue to have a